Mafia Boss left his pregnant wife for a model, then his 3 secret sons appeared at his door. Lorenzo Vescari pressed his pen against the paper and signed his name without looking up while 15 feet away. Behind a closed hospital door, his wife was hemorrhaging on a delivery table. The attorney slid the next page forward. Lorenzo signed that one too. A nurse burst into the hallway. "Mr. Vescari, your wife is asking for you." "It's serious, I'm busy." He didn't turn around. The nurse stood there, blinking, like she couldn't process what she was hearing from a man whose wife fighting to stay alive on the other side of that wall. Lorenzo signed the final page, capped his pen, and handed the folder back to his attorney. "Is it done?" "It's done, sir." "Good." He straightened his jacket. "Let me know when the babies are delivered." He said it the way a man might say, "Let me know when the car is detailed." That moment, that exact, quiet, monstrous moment is where this story begins. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time, because what happens to Valentina Moretti over the next 2 hours is the kind of stories that will stay with you long after it's over. Hit that like button. Drop your city or country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with us until the very end, because you will not see this ending coming. This is a work of complete fiction created for dramatic entertainment. All characters, organizations, and events are entirely imaginary. Valentina Moretti had not always been the kind of woman who followed her husband. She had been, for most of her 29 years, the kind of woman who stayed, who waited, who told herself that patience was a form of strength, that silence was a form of grace, and that love, real love, the kind her mother had described in the letters she left behind when she died, was something you had to be willing to bleed for. She had been willing to bleed for Lorenzo Vescari since the night they met at a charity gala 4 years earlier, when he was 36 and already the most dangerous man in the room, and she was 25 and the most unguarded. She hadn't known what he was. Not fully. She had heard the name, everyone in Chicago had heard the name, but there is a distance between hearing something and understanding it, the same way there is a distance between seeing fire and knowing what it takes from you when it finally reaches your hand. Lorenzo was magnetic in the way that certain men are magnetic, not because they are kind, but because they are certain. He moved through rooms like he had already decided how everything was going to end. He looked at Valentina that first night across a table of people who didn't matter, and she felt, stupidly and completely, like she was the only person in the building. They were married 11 months later. For 2 years, she told herself it was good. He was never warm. Exactly, Lorenzo Vescari was not a warm man, but he was present, which she confused for the same thing. He came home. He sat across from her at dinner. He asked occasionally how she was feeling. She filled the spaces he left with her own interpretation, the way lonely people fill silence with the version of a story they need to believe. Then she got pregnant. She had expected, she didn't know what she had expected. A shift in him, some softening at the edges. She told him on a Tuesday evening in their kitchen, holding the test in both hands like it was fragile, watching his face for the thing she had convinced herself would finally arrive. Lorenzo had looked at the test, then at her. Then he'd said, "I'll have the doctor's number sent to your phone," and walked out of the kitchen to take a call. She stood there for a long time after that. She should have understood then. She almost did, but understanding something and accepting it are two different kinds of pain, and Valentina wasn't ready for the second kind yet. The pregnancy progressed in the particular loneliness of a marriage that had already quietly ended while pretending otherwise. Lorenzo was polite, distant in the particular way of a man who has made a decision he hasn't announced yet. He came to one doctor's appointment, the first one, and checked his phone the entire time. When the ultrasound technician said triplets, Lorenzo had gone very still, and Valentina had felt, for one foolish second, that maybe this was the thing that would finally crack something open in him. He looked at the screen, 3 heartbeats, 3 distinct shadows curled into each other. He said nothing. He left before the appointment was over. By her 7th month, Lorenzo was rarely home before midnight. She didn't ask where he went. She told herself she didn't want to know. The truth was, she was already afraid of what she'd find, and fear has a way of making cowards out of people who were brave before they had something to lose. It was Carla, her housekeeper, a thick-armed woman in her 60s, who had worked in the Vescari house for 8 years and had the loyalty of someone who'd seen too much to pretend otherwise, but who said it plainly one morning in October. "Mrs. Vescari, Carla didn't look up from the dishes. There's talk. In the house. Among the staff. Valentina was sitting at the kitchen island, both hands around a cup of tea she wasn't drinking. Her belly was enormous by then, heavy and tight, and she moved through the world at half speed with the particular exhaustion of late pregnancy. Talk about what? Carla set down the glass she was drying. Finally looked at her. There's a woman. A model. Bianca Romano. She said the name carefully, like it cost her something. He's been taking her to the penthouse on Michigan Avenue. The one he keeps for business. The cup was warm in Valentina's hands. She focused on that. The warmth. The weight of it. How long, she said. 8 months. Carla's voice was steady, but her eyes weren't. Maybe longer. 8 months, before the pregnancy announcement. Before Valentina had stood in that kitchen, holding that test like an offering. She set the cup down very carefully, so it didn't make a sound. Thank you, Carla. Mrs. Vescari, thank you. She didn't cry. She sat at that kitchen island for 40 minutes after Carla left the room, her hands flat on the marble, her babies moving inside her, the way they always did in the late morning restless little kicks, small and insistent, like they were reminding her they were real. This was real, that whatever happened next had to account for them. She made a decision. She was going to see it for herself. She needed to, because there was still a part of her, the part that had stayed, and waited and filled in silences that needed to look at the truth directly before she could stop trying to argue with it. She called her driver and gave him the address on Michigan Avenue. She was 32 weeks pregnant. Her feet had been swollen for a month. She hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in longer than she could remember. She stood in the elevator of that building, wearing a coat that wouldn't button over her belly anymore, watching the floor numbers climb, and she understood with a kind of cold clarity that she had already lost something she couldn't name yet. The penthouse was on the 14th floor. The hallway was quiet, that particular expensive quiet of buildings, where the walls are thick enough to absorb everything. She could hear her own breathing. She walked slowly because she had to, one hand on the wall, the other resting against her stomach. The door was open. Not fully 4 or 5 inches, but enough. She heard his voice first, Lorenzo's voice, low and unhurried, the same voice that had said "I do" in front of 200 people 3 years ago. She'd know it anywhere. It's already handled, he was saying. The filing is done. By the time she realizes what's happening, it'll be over. A woman's voice, musical, younger, a little uncertain. You're sure she doesn't know? Valentina doesn't know anything she doesn't want to know. A pause. Something that might have been a laugh. That's always been her problem. Valentina stood in that hallway with her hand on her stomach and felt something inside her go very quiet. Not numb. Quiet. The way the world goes quiet right before something breaks. And the babies? Bianca's voice again. I'll handle the custody situation. My lawyers are already working on it. Another pause. She's not stable. Emotionally. We can document that. The pregnancy's complicated things medically. There are grounds. Lorenzo, I said I'll handle it. His voice sharpened just slightly. Trust me. Valentina took one step back, then another. She didn't make a sound. She turned and walked back to the elevator, and she pressed the button, and she stood there watching the door to that penthouse until the elevator arrived, and the doors closed in front of her, and only then, only in that small metal box, alone, going down, did she put both hands over her face and let herself understand the full scope of what she had just heard. He wasn't just leaving her. He was building the case to take her children. The next 3 weeks were the kind of quiet that precedes a flood. Valentina went through the motions of her daily life with a patience she had never needed before, because patience now had a different purpose. She was no longer waiting for Lorenzo to change. She was waiting for the right moment to move, but she was 8 months pregnant and she didn't have a plan, and she had no idea that the plan, such as it was already being made without her. She had one person she trusted completely, her friend Nina, who had grown up in the same South Side neighborhood, who had watched Valentina walk into the Vescari world with the particular concern of someone who could see clearly because she was outside the frame. Nina brought groceries. Nina sat with her at the kitchen table at 10 o'clock at night and didn't fill the silence with reassurance, which was the most useful thing anyone could have done. You need a lawyer, Nina said one evening, not one of his. Yours. I don't have money that's separate from his. Then we find someone who'll work on contingency. Nina leaned forward. Valley's already in motion, you know that. You cannot sit still. I'm 34 weeks pregnant. I know. I can barely put on my shoes. I know that too. Nina's voice didn't waver. But the people who work for him are moving right now, while you're sitting here. Do you understand that? She understood it. She just didn't know what she was supposed to do with the understanding when her body felt like it was made of lead, and her mind kept returning, against her will, to the memory of standing in that hallway, hearing her husband's voice explain how he planned to dismantle her life. She contacted a family law attorney named Greg Walsh, found him through Nina, who had found him through a contact from her job at a downtown nonprofit. Walsh was in his early 50s, broad-shouldered, with the particular no-nonsense quality of a man who had spent 20 years in family court and had stopped being surprised by anything. He met Valentina in a coffee shop 2 miles from the Vescari house, and he listened to everything she said without taking notes, which she found either very reassuring or very alarming. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "You understand who your husband is," Walsh said. It wasn't a question. Yes, his legal team is going to come at this hard. They have resources I don't have. The only way I can protect you is if we move fast and document everything. He looked at her directly. What do you have? She thought about that. She had a phone with the address of the Michigan Avenue penthouse in her recent searches. She had the name Bianca Romano, which Carla had given her. She had the memory of a door left open 4 inches and a voice explaining that she was unstable and could be documented as such. She had almost nothing. Carla might testify, she said. She's been in the house for 8 years. That's something. And Lorenzo's financial records, I have access to some of the household accounts. Not his business accounts, but some. Walsh nodded slowly. Start pulling anything you can access legitimately. Don't take anything that isn't yours to take. And call me the minute anything changes. He glanced at her belly with the frank pragmatism of a man who had handled difficult situations before. Including medically. How far along are you? 34 weeks. Then we're working against 2 clocks, he said. Let's not waste any more time. What Walsh didn't tell her, what she would only learn later, was that he had already received a call from a man named Matteo Bellarosa's assistant 2 days before their meeting, asking him to take Valentina Moretti's case and assuring him that costs would not be an issue. She didn't know yet who Matteo Bellarosa was. She didn't know yet why he cared. Lorenzo came home that Thursday at 7 in the evening, which was unusually early, and Valentina understood immediately that this was deliberate, that he was performing normalcy for a reason she didn't know yet. He sat at the dinner table. He asked how she was feeling. He told her about a meeting downtown, something about a real estate deal, the kind of conversation designed to fill space without conveying anything. She watched him. She was good at watching people. She always had been. It was, in some ways, the thing that had gotten her into this marriage and the thing that was going to have to get her out. Lorenzo was managing something. She could see it in the way he handled his fork. In the particular quality of his attention, he was not relaxed. He was performing relaxed, which are 2 very different things. My attorney wants to meet with us next week, he said midway through the meal, looking at his plate. She felt the floor shift slightly under her, but her face didn't move. About what? Some financial planning. Estate stuff. It makes sense to have things organized before the babies come. Of course, she said. She did not say, I know what filing is already done. She did not say, I heard you in that hallway. She did not say, I have already spoken to my own attorney, and I am already doing what I can with what I have. She said, of course. Just let me know the date. He looked up at her then, just for a second, quickly like he was checking something, looking for some sign that she knew, that she'd found out. That the floor under him had shifted the same way it had under her. She gave him nothing. She looked back at her plate and asked if he wanted more bread, and Lorenzo Vescari, one of the most dangerous men in Chicago, looked at his almost ex-wife across a dinner table and saw only what she needed him to see. 2 weeks later, at 4 in the morning, Valentina woke up with a pain in her lower back that was different from the aches she'd grown accustomed to. She lay still for a minute, timing it, knowing already but needing to be sure. Then she got up very carefully and called Nina. I need you to take me to the hospital. Now, Val, is it? Yes, and don't call Lorenzo until I tell you to. She was 36 weeks, 4 weeks early. She didn't know yet that early labor with triplets carries risks that single pregnancy early labor doesn't. She didn't know yet the exact sequence of what was about to happen to her body over the next 18 hours. She knew only that she was afraid, not in a panicked way, but in the deep, cold way of someone who understands that they are about to go through something very hard without the person who was supposed to be beside them. She had known for weeks that Lorenzo was not going to be beside her. But knowing something and living through it are different. She was about to live through it. Nina drove her. Valentina sat in the passenger seat and breathed and timed and didn't speak much, because speaking took effort she was conserving. Nina was focused and quiet the way she always was in a crisis, the particular competence of someone who doesn't fall apart because she knows that falling apart is a luxury nobody can afford right now. The hospital intake was efficient, alarming in the ways hospital intake is always alarming when you say the words premature and triplets in the same sentence. They moved her fast. There were people and monitors and numbers being called out, and a young resident who was trying very hard not to show that she was concerned, but was very clearly concerned. At 7 in the morning, two things happened at almost the same time. Valentina's blood pressure spiked to a level that alarmed everyone in the room, and someone called Lorenzo. It wasn't Nina. Nina had kept her word. It was someone at the hospital, following standard procedure, notifying the name listed as emergency contact. Lorenzo Vescari arrived at Chicago Presbyterian at 7:42 in the morning. He walked in wearing a suit, not the suit of a man who had rushed from home in an emergency, but the suit of a man who had taken the time to dress properly before leaving, because the optics of how he arrived at his wife's emergency were something he had apparently considered. His attorney, David Harlow, arrived 12 minutes later. They stood together in the hallway outside the delivery suite, where Valentina's blood pressure was being managed and her babies were being monitored and the medical team was making decisions. Nobody was explaining to anyone in the hallway. Lorenzo's face was composed. That was the word for it. Not worried, composed. The face of a man attending to a logistical matter. Harlow had a folder. Of course he had a folder. Walsh arrived 20 minutes after that, because Nina had called him the moment Lorenzo walked through the hospital doors. Walsh was not in a suit. He'd clearly thrown on clothes in a hurry, and he looked rumpled and wide awake in the particular way of someone who runs on urgency rather than appearances. He planted himself at the other end of the hallway, and when Lorenzo noticed him and understood who he was, Lorenzo's composed face did something complicated. He looked at Harlow. Harlow said something quietly. Lorenzo looked at Walsh again. Then he looked at the door to the delivery suite just for a second, and whatever he thought about what was happening behind that door stayed entirely behind his own face. A nurse came out. She moved toward Lorenzo because he was the listed emergency contact, and she said, clearly and with the particular urgency of someone who needed to be understood, "Mr. Vescari, your wife's condition is serious. She's asking for you." "You should." "One moment," Lorenzo said. The nurse stared. "I said 1 moment." He turned back to Harlow and held out his hand for the folder. The nurse stood there for 3 seconds. Valentina would learn this later from Nina, who had been watching from the waiting area down the hall, who would describe the nurse's expression in terms that were not polite, but were entirely accurate. Then the nurse turned and went back inside, because there was nothing else to do. And Lorenzo Vescari uncapped a pen and began to sign the papers that legally ended his marriage to the woman who was hemorrhaging on the other side of the wall. Page 1. Page 2. The monitoring equipment in the delivery suite beeped continuously. One of the residents called for the attending, something in his voice that was not calm. There was a flurry of movement. Someone said a number that meant the situation had worsened. Page 3. He signed his name. The door burst open, and a different nurse came into the hallway, older, someone who had been in this hospital for 20 years, someone who had run out of patience for the particular cruelties that people with money performed in her building. She looked at Lorenzo Vescari directly. "Your wife is in crisis," she said. "If you want to be in that room before," she stopped. "Recalibrated. You need to make a decision right now." Lorenzo looked up from the folder. He looked at the door. Then he looked at Harlow and said quietly, "Is that everything?" Harlow confirmed that it was. Lorenzo handed the folder back. He straightened his jacket. He stood in the hallway for 9 hours. He did not go in. And inside that room, Valentina Moretti, who had followed her husband to a penthouse and heard the future being arranged without her, who had sat at dinner and given him nothing, who had called her friend at 4 in the morning and said, "Don't call," Lorenzo was fighting for her life and for the lives of 3 children she had decided to protect before she had any idea how she was going to do it. She lost consciousness twice during the delivery. The attending would later tell her this with the careful language of a doctor who wants a patient to understand the severity without causing additional distress. Both times she came back. She came back the way people come back when they are not finished. Not because anything is arranged or promised, but because there is something that needs to be done first. At 4:17 in the afternoon, all three babies were delivered alive. Small, early, beautiful and terrible and screaming in the particular way of newborns who have arrived into a world that is not quite ready for them. Valentina was semi-conscious when they held the first one up to her not long, just a moment, just long enough for her to see a face no larger than her hand, creased and red and absolutely furious at everything. She said one word, mine. Then she was out again. When the attending emerged to speak with the people in the hallway, Lorenzo was standing with his hands in his pockets. Walsh was 15 feet away on the phone. 3 boys, the attending said. They're in the NICU. Early, but we're cautiously optimistic. Your wife is stable. He paused. She's asking to see the children. Lorenzo was quiet for a moment. And her medical status, he said. Is there documentation of her mental and emotional state during... The attending looked at him for a long time. Mr. Vescari, he said in a very specific tone of voice that was not a shout and not a whisper, but something that communicated more than either your wife almost died today. 3 times, Lorenzo held his gaze. I understand that. Is there documentation? The attending turned and walked away without answering. Lorenzo turned to Harlow, said something quiet that Walsh from 15 feet away couldn't quite hear. What Walsh could hear what he would report to Valentina later, sitting beside her hospital bed while she held a photograph of 3 faces. She hadn't been cleared to visit yet, was the word petition. The filing to challenge Valentina's custody of her own children. It had already been prepared. It was going to be submitted before she was discharged from the hospital. The strategy was exactly what Lorenzo had described to Bianca in that penthouse: document the instability, cite the medical complications, argue that a woman who had undergone emergency delivery with blood pressure events and periods of unconsciousness was not currently capable of providing a stable environment for 3 premature infants. It was in its way elegant. It was built entirely on facts: her complications, her recovery, the NICU stay for the babies twisted into a shape they were never meant to hold. Walsh told Valentina this on the 3rd day, when she was stable enough to understand what was being said to her. He told her quickly and clearly without softening, because she had asked him to do it that way. She listened. She was attached to an IV. There were bruises on her arms from needles, and her body ached in ways she had no language for yet. Down the hall, 3 boys who weighed under 4 pounds each were in incubators with monitors taped to their chests, and the hospital's policy around visitation in the NICU had been subtly complicated by an administrative flag that Walsh's paralegal had just discovered and was trying to untangle. The flag, Valentina said. Lorenzo, his attorney, made a call. Walsh confirmed. Nothing official yet. But someone in hospital administration received a communication suggesting that visitation access might be disputed pending a custody filing. She closed her eyes. I haven't held them, she said. I gave birth to them and I haven't held them. Walsh didn't offer anything to fill that sentence. He was smart enough to know that some sentences don't want filling. What do we do, she said. Before Walsh could answer, the door opened. Neither of them was expecting anyone. Nina was at the coffee machine. The nurse wasn't due for another hour. Valentina looked at the door with the reflexive wariness of someone who had learned that uninvited arrivals rarely bring good news. The man who walked in was tall not in an aggressive way, but in the settled, permanent way of someone who had occupied space long enough to be completely comfortable in it. He was perhaps 60, with gray at his temples, and a face that had the particular quality of someone who made decisions for a living. He was not in a suit, which surprised her. He wore dark slacks and a simple jacket, and he looked at Valentina in the hospital bed with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. It wasn't pity, which she was grateful for, and it wasn't the aggressive warmth of someone trying to get something. It was something more like recognition, like he'd been waiting to be in this room. Walsh stood up immediately. Can I help you? The man didn't look at Walsh. He looked at Valentina. My name is Matteo Bellarosa, he said. I think it's time we talked about your mother. Valentina felt the specific cold of a moment when the world you thought you understood reveals a dimension you didn't know was there. She had not heard that name before Bellarosa, but the way Walsh went very still beside her told her something. The way the man said it told her something else. The way he looked at her, like she was something he'd been looking for a long time, told her the rest. "I don't know you," she said. "I know." He pulled a chair from the corner of the room without being invited and set it beside her bed and sat down with the ease of a man who takes rooms as he finds them. "But I knew your mother, and I've known about you since before you were born." He folded his hands. "And I need you to understand that what is happening to you right now, this man, his attorneys, the flag on this hospital, all of it is about to stop." Walsh found his voice. "Who are you two?" "I'm the reason she's still alive," Matteo said quietly, still looking at Valentina. "The surgical team that was available when her blood pressure spiked. 3 days ago I had those physicians on retainer at this hospital for 2 years. Waiting," he paused. "Not for this specifically, but for things like this." The room was very quiet. Outside, somewhere down the hall, a machine beeped steadily. Valentina looked at this stranger, this man who had walked into her hospital room and was saying things that she had no framework to evaluate, and she did the things she had always done. She watched him. She looked for the gap between what he was saying and what he was doing. She looked at his hands, his stillness, the way his eyes hadn't moved from her face. She had spent 4 years married to a dangerous man. She knew what dangerous looked like. Matteo Bellarosa looked like something different. Something older. Something that had passed through dangerous and out the other side into something she didn't have a word for. "What does my mother have to do with any of this?" she said. Matteo reached into his jacket pocket and placed something on the edge of her bed. A photograph, old, the color slightly faded in the particular way of prints from the early 90s. A woman she recognized, younger than Valentina ever knew her, standing beside a man whose face was unfamiliar. The woman was laughing. She looked free, in the photograph, in a way Valentina had never seen. "Your mother was born Elisa Bellarosa," Matteo said. "My younger sister. She left the family when she was 22 because she wanted nothing to do with what we were. She changed her name. She built a different life." His voice didn't change. "And she raised you without telling you any of it because she wanted you to be free of it too." Valentina looked at the photograph. Her mother had been dead for 7 years. She had died of cancer quietly, in the apartment on the south side where Valentina had grown up. She had been, as far as Valentina had ever known, a woman alone, no family, no history she chose to discuss, a past that she kept folded up small and never opened in front of her daughter. She had always assumed it was grief, some loss that her mother carried. She had never known the loss was a choice. "She left," Valentina said. "She left." Matteo nodded slowly, "And I let her go, because she asked me to, and because I loved her enough to do what she asked even when I thought she was wrong." His jaw tightened slightly. "I've thought about that decision for 30 years. What does this mean?" Walsh said carefully, "in terms of the current." "It means," Matteo said, turning to Walsh for the first time, "that those 3 children in the NICU down the hall are Bellarosa heirs. And the Bellarosa family does not leave its own in situations like this one." He looked back at Valentina. "The administrative flag on your visitation access will be removed within the hour. The attorneys filing that custody challenge are about to discover that 3 of their key witnesses have become unavailable, and that certain financial arrangements underpinning Lorenzo Vescari's legal strategy have developed complications." He said it all in the even tone of someone reporting weather. "And Mr. Vescari himself is going to have a very difficult day tomorrow." Valentina was quiet for a long time. She looked at the photograph of her mother, laughing, young, free. She thought about standing in that hallway on Michigan Avenue, one hand on the wall, one on her belly, listening to a man explain how he was going to erase her. She thought about signing papers at 4 in the morning, about the nurse's face, about the word mine, which was the only word she'd been able to manage, when they held her son up to her before she went under. She looked at Matteo Bellarosa, this stranger who was somehow her uncle, this man who had known about her since before she was born, and had let her mother have the life she'd chosen, and had apparently been watching at a distance all this time, which was either the most devoted act of restraint she had ever encountered, or something more complicated that she was too exhausted to evaluate right now. "I want to see my son," she said. "That's the only thing I want right now. Everything else, all of this I'll deal with. But I want to see my sons." Matteo stood. He didn't say, "of course," or "right away," or any of the smoothing language that people use when they want to seem in control of things. He walked to the door. opened it, said something to someone in the hallway that Valentina couldn't hear. Then he came back and sat down. "Give it 20 minutes," he said. She gave it 20 minutes, and at the end of those 20 minutes, a nurse appeared, a different nurse from any who had appeared before. Someone Valentina didn't recognize, and said that visitation to the NICU had been cleared, and that if Mrs. Vescari felt well enough to be moved in a wheelchair, she could go see her children. Mrs. Vescari felt well enough. She sat in the wheelchair, and Walsh walked beside her, and Matteo followed at a distance, which told her something about him, that he understood when to take up space and when to give it. The NICU smelled of antiseptic and something underneath it, something warmer and less definable, the particular atmosphere of rooms where very small lives are being held together by machinery and attention and sheer biological insistence. She was brought to a section with 3 incubators side by side. Someone had arranged them that way, close enough that she could see all 3 without turning her head, which was the kind of thoughtfulness that undoes you when you're not braced for it. She looked at her sons. 3 faces, each one slightly different brows, different mouths, different arrangements of features that were still too new to have settled into permanence. Each one attached to wires and monitors that beeped in a rhythm that the NICU nurse explained was good, stable, promising. Valentina reached into the nearest incubator and put her hand very gently against the chest of the nearest baby. She felt his heart beating, steady and small and entirely real. She had almost not made it to this moment. Lorenzo had signed his name 3 times while she was hemorrhaging, and she had almost not made it here. But she had, and they had, and the woman who had followed her husband to a penthouse, because she was still trying not to see what was in front of her, that woman was gone. She had gone somewhere during 18 hours of labor, somewhere unreachable, and what was left in her place was something quieter and harder and entirely clear about what came next. Her sons were going to be safe. Whatever that cost, whatever it required, wherever this story was about to go, they were going to be safe. She stayed in the NICU for 2 hours. When she finally let them take her back to her room, she found Walsh waiting with his phone and a look that told her something had happened. "The custody filing," he said. "Harlow withdrew it an hour ago." She looked at Matteo, who was sitting in the same chair as before, like he had never moved. "What did you do?" she said. "I made some calls," he said. "That's not an answer." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her steadily. "The answer is that Lorenzo's finances are about to become very complicated. 2 of his business partners have been contacted by federal investigators, which they will discover tomorrow morning. His primary holding company has a lien on it as of this afternoon that his attorneys haven't told him about yet, and Bianca Romano has decided that she would like to speak with someone." Valentina absorbed this. Why is she willing to talk? "Because she's frightened," Matteo said, "and because what Lorenzo was planning for those children once he had custody was not what he told her it was. She believed he wanted to be a father." He paused. "He wanted the Bellarosa connection. He knew about your mother's family. Not everything, not the full picture, but enough to understand that those children represented an access point he couldn't get any other way." The room was very quiet. Outside the window, Chicago continued in its gray October way, traffic and distance, and the particular indifference of a city to the dramas of its inhabitants. Valentina thought about Lorenzo sitting at that dinner table, performing normalcy. She thought about his stillness when the ultrasound screen showed 3 heartbeats. She had thought that moment of stillness was shock. Now she understood it might have been calculation. "He knew," she said. "About my mother's family, he suspected. Enough to be interested." Matteo's voice was flat. "He married you because you were beautiful and well-connected enough to be useful. He stayed when you got pregnant because he began to understand that the bloodline those children would carry was worth more to him than anything else." He looked at her directly. "And when he decided he didn't need you anymore, when he thought he could get the children without you," he began to move. She understood now why he had never been warm. He had been calculating. The entire marriage, the dinners and the polite questions, and the single doctor's appointment and the signing of papers and the signing of Briz, while she hemorrhaged all of it had been management. She had been managed. She should have felt something enormous at that understanding. Rage, maybe, or devastation, the way you feel when a large and irreversible thing is confirmed. But she found, sitting in that hospital bed, that what she felt was something smaller and more precise relief. Not because it was over, it wasn't over, Not nearly, but because she finally understood the shape of the thing she was dealing with. You can't fight something you can't see clearly. She could see it clearly now. She looked at Walsh. "What do I need to do next?" she said. Walsh opened his folder, and the work began. This is a work of complete fiction created for dramatic entertainment. All characters, organizations, and events are entirely imaginary. The folder Walsh opened was thinner than Valentina expected. She had been imagining something comprehensive: documentation, strategy, a clear path forward laid out in numbered steps. What she got instead was 4 pages and a legal pad with handwritten notes in the margins, which told her something about exactly how fast Walsh had been moving and exactly how little runway they actually had. "Right now, our strongest position is the withdrawal of the custody filing," Walsh said, setting the folder on the edge of the bed. "Harlow pulled it, but that's temporary. He'll refile the moment he thinks the pressure is off. What we need before that happens is to establish your legal standing as primary parent of record, document your medical recovery in terms that counter any stability argument, and get those babies' birth certificates filed correctly." He looked up. "Has Lorenzo made any move to be listed as the filing parent?" "I don't know. I need to find out today." He made a note. "The other issue is housing. You can't go back to his house." "I know that. Do you have somewhere to go?" She didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer. Nina's apartment was a 1-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a walk-up in Pilsen. She had no money that wasn't tied to Lorenzo's accounts, and she had no illusions about how quickly those accounts would become inaccessible the moment Lorenzo decided to move that particular lever. Matteo, from his chair in the corner, said, "I have a property on the North Shore. Fully staffed. Security on the perimeter." He said it without inflection, like he was offering a ride. "It's been prepared." Valentina looked at him. "For how long has it been prepared?" He met her eyes. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. He had known 3 weeks ago that this was coming. Before the delivery, before the hospital, before the folder and the pen and the hallway, and all of it Matteo Bellarosa had already arranged somewhere for her to go. She didn't know whether that made her feel protected or like a piece being moved on a board she hadn't known she was sitting on. "I'm not going anywhere until my sons are discharged," she said. "Of course. And I want Walsh with me every step until then." "Agreed. And I want to know everything, not summaries. Not the version where you decide what I can handle." She looked at him steadily. "Everything." Matteo was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to comply, but the quiet of someone recalibrating their assessment of who they were talking to. "Everything," he said. That night, after Walsh left, and the hospital settled into its particular nighttime register of distant footsteps and monitor beeps, and the occasional muffled exchange at the nurse's station, Valentina lay awake and thought about her mother. Elisa. She had called her mom, always never Elisa, never anything that suggested she was a separate person with a history of her own. She had been, in Valentina's childhood, the fixed point. One consistent thing. She cooked on Sundays and kept the apartment relentlessly clean and worked double shifts at a medical records office and came home tired but never defeated, and if she had a past she didn't speak of, Valentina had assumed it was the past of a woman who had survived something painful and chosen not to carry it into the present. She had not assumed it was an entire family, an entire name, an entire world. She thought about what Matteo had said. She left because she wanted nothing to do with what we were. What they were, a crime family. Power built on things Elisa Moretti, Elisa Bellarosa, had decided her daughter would never be touched by. And then Valentina had walked into a room with Lorenzo Vescari and fallen for a man who was exactly what her mother had spent 20 years keeping her away from. She almost laughed. She didn't, because laughing hurt her incision, and because it wasn't really funny, it was the kind of thing that would be funny later, in the distant future, when enough time had passed to make it a story rather than a wound. Right now it was still a wound. She turned carefully onto her side and looked at the dark window and thought about 3 small faces in 3 incubators and a heartbeat she had felt with her palm. She was going to have to be very good at this, whatever this was. She was going to have to be better than she had ever been at anything. Lorenzo came to the hospital the next morning. She knew he was coming before he arrived. The charge nurse, a compact woman named Sandra, who had appointed herself Valentina's primary point of contact with a decisiveness that Valentina found deeply comforting, appeared in the doorway at 8:45 with a particular expression. "Your husband is downstairs," Sandra said. He's asking to come up. He's not my husband. The divorce filing had been executed. He was legally precisely her ex-husband, though the word felt strange in her mouth, too simple for the thing it was describing. Is there a reason he can't be turned away? Hospital policy allows immediate family visitation with the patient's consent. Given that the custody situation is in flux, Sandra chose the word carefully. Administration isn't comfortable restricting his access to the NICU without a legal order. Walsh is getting that order. I know, but it's not here yet. Valentina thought for a moment. Let him come up, she said. I want to talk to him. Sandra's expression did not change, but something in her eyes said she thought this was a bad idea. She left anyway because it wasn't her decision. Valentina sat up straighter in the bed. She ran a hand over her hair, which needed washing, and which she didn't have the energy to care about. She thought about what she needed from this conversation and what she was willing to give. She needed to understand how much he knew. About Matteo. About the Bellarosa connection. About exactly how much of his strategy had already crumbled, and whether he had grasped the full dimensions of it, or whether he was still operating on last week's information. She was willing to give him nothing. Lorenzo walked in at 9 o'clock. He looked tired. Not devastated. Lorenzo Vescari did not do devastated. It wasn't in his register, but tired in the particular way of a man who has been working very hard to hold something together and is beginning to feel the strain of it. He was in a gray suit, which was lighter than his usual palette. His tie was not perfectly knotted, which she noticed because it was always perfectly knotted, which meant either he had dressed in a hurry or the edges of his control were showing. He stopped just inside the door, took in the room. Took in her. You look better than I expected, he said. I almost died, she said. What did you expect? He moved to the chair beside the bed, the same chair Matteo had occupied, and sat in it without being invited. He sat forward, elbows on his knees, which was an uncharacteristically casual posture for him. Like he was trying to seem less threatening. Or like he'd been coached on body language and was executing the coaching imperfectly. I want to talk about the children, he said. Then talk. The filing was premature. He said it the way you say the flight was delayed, a logistical fact, mildly regrettable. Harlow moved too fast. I've asked him to give us space to discuss this directly. There's nothing to discuss directly. You filed to challenge my custody of our children while I was in the ICU. Your attorney put an administrative flag on my visitation access. I was separated from my sons for 3 days after delivering them. She kept her voice even. That's not something we discuss. That's something my attorney responds to. Lorenzo's jaw moved, just slightly. I was protecting my interests. Your interests. She let that sit. 3 premature babies in an incubator are your interests. They're my children too. Are they? It came out quieter than she intended, which made it land harder. Because the way you behaved in this hospital, Lorenzo, the way you behaved in that hallway with your pen and your folder while I was bleeding, doesn't suggest someone who was thinking about his children. His eyes went flat. She knew that look. It was the look he got when a conversation was not going the way he had planned, and he was deciding whether to adjust the approach or abandon it entirely. Things happened quickly, he said. I reacted badly. I'm telling you that. Is that an apology? It's an acknowledgement. Those are different things. Valentina, who told you about my mother's family. She said it without preamble, without a transition, because she wanted to see his face at the exact moment the question arrived. She saw it. It was fast a flicker, a fraction of a second, and then it was gone, smoothed over by the practiced composure of a man who controlled his expressions the way other men controlled their breathing. But it was there. I don't know what you mean, he said. You do. He looked at her steadily. Your mother's family. The Bellarosas. She watched his throat move. Say the name Lorenzo. Let's stop pretending you've never heard it. The silence that followed was the kind that contains a decision being made. I heard rumors, he said finally, before we married, that your mother had a connection to a crime family. I didn't know the details. Didn't know or didn't have them yet. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm asking you a direct question and waiting to see if you'll answer it directly, which you haven't done once in this conversation. She kept her hands folded in her lap. She was very tired and her body hurt, and she had not slept more than 3 hours. And she was doing this anyway, because she needed the information. Did you know who my sons are in terms of Bellarosa bloodline before you began the custody proceedings? Lorenzo stood up. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't push the chair back, didn't raise his voice. He simply stood with the controlled movement of someone who has decided the conversation is over and is arranging their exit. I came here to talk about our children, he said. And I asked you a question about our children. I'll be in touch through Harlow. Of course you will. She looked up at him from the bed, the particular indignity of having to look up, of being the person in the bed while he was the person standing, the person who could walk out. She was aware of it. She let it go. Lorenzo, her voice stopped him at the door. Matteo Bellarosa knows what you were planning, not the pieces of it. All of it. She watched his shoulder blades tighten under his jacket. However you thought this was going to go, that's not how it's going to go. He didn't turn around. He left. And Valentina let out a breath she had been holding for 45 minutes and reached for the call button to ask for more pain medications because the conversation had cost her more than she had allocated for it. Walsh arrived an hour later with the legal order restricting Lorenzo's NICU access pending the custody resolution, which had been expedited by a judge whose name Valentina didn't recognize and whose speed Walsh couldn't entirely explain, except that Matteo had made calls. Matteo made a lot of calls. She was beginning to understand that this was his primary instrument, not violence, not threats, but calls. The quiet application of weight in places where weight changed outcomes. It was, she thought, more effective than the alternative and considerably harder to prosecute. Bianca Romano arrived at the hospital that afternoon. Valentina had not asked for this meeting. Matteo had arranged it, and Walsh had approved it as potentially useful, and Valentina had agreed because she wanted to see the woman. Not out of anger, she had moved past whatever jealousy she might have felt, which had been considerable once and felt very small now in the context of everything else. She wanted to see her because Bianca was the only person who had been inside Lorenzo's confidence during the period when he was building the strategy against Valentina, and Valentina needed to understand the full shape of that strategy. Bianca was beautiful. Of course, Valentina had known this, had absorbed this information from Carla that morning in the kitchen without allowing herself to feel it fully. Beautiful in the very specific way of women who are accustomed to being looked at and have organized their self-understanding around it. She was 26, dark-haired, with a slightly startled quality of someone who had recently discovered that the world she thought she was in was actually something else entirely. She came in without her coat. She'd left it somewhere, apparently, or forgotten it. Details were beyond her right now, and she stood just inside the door of Valentina's room and looked at Valentina with an expression that was trying to be composed and wasn't quite getting there. "I'm sorry," she said. "First thing, no preamble." Her voice was unsteady. I know it doesn't fix anything. I just needed to say it first." Valentina looked at her. "Sit down," she said. Bianca sat. "Tell me what he told you," Valentina said. "About the children. About the custody plan. All of it from the beginning." Bianca pressed her hands together in her lap. She was wearing rings, expensive ones, the kind Lorenzo gave as management tools, and she twisted one of them without seeming to notice she was doing it. "He told me you were unstable," she said, "that you'd been having mental health problems during the pregnancy, that the delivery complications were going to give him grounds." "That's not what I'm asking." Valentina kept her voice level. "I know the legal strategy. I'm asking what he told you about why he wanted the children." Bianca looked up. "He said he wanted to be a father." Her voice cracked slightly on the last word. He said he'd made mistakes with your marriage, but that the children were innocent, and he wanted to be present for them. That keeping them with you would be, he said, you were too fragile. That it wasn't safe. Did you believe him?" The rings again. Twisting. "I wanted to." She said it very quietly. He was convincing. Lorenzo is always convincing. Something shifted in her expression. But then things started changing. 3 weeks ago. There were conversations on the phone, late at night. He'd moved to another room. He started asking me questions about your family. Your mother, specifically. Who she was, where she'd come from, whether you'd ever mentioned relatives. She paused. And I started thinking, why does any of that matter, if he just wants to be the children's father? "It matters," Valentina said, "because his interest in the children has nothing to do with being their father." Bianca absorbed this slowly, like water through stone. "He was using me," she said. "He was using everyone." Valentina watched the woman across from her process something she had been trying not to process for weeks. She didn't feel sorry for her. Exactly, she didn't have the bandwidth for that right now, but she felt something adjacent to it. The particular recognition of someone who has been in the same configuration, different chair. What changed your mind about coming to talk? 2 days ago, he told me I needed to stay at a hotel for a few days. Said he had business to handle. Bianca's voice steadied slightly, took on the particular flatness of someone reporting facts. He sent someone with cash and told me not to use my credit cards and not to contact anyone. And I sat in that hotel room and thought about everything, the questions about your family, the custody plan, the way he'd been talking about the babies like they were assets. She stopped. I'm not stupid. I grew up in this city. I know what people like Lorenzo do when they want to move something of value without anyone tracking it. The room was very quiet. Valentina thought about what Matteo had said. What Lorenzo was planning for those children was not what he told her it was. He was going to take them, Valentina said, not through the courts. He was building the custody case as cover to establish legal standing. But his real plan was to take them and move them before the Bellarosa family could respond. Bianca didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence confirmed it. Walsh, who had been sitting quietly near the window taking notes, looked up. His face was doing something careful and controlled that told Valentina this compliment had just changed the legal situation significantly. Miss Romano, he said, would you be willing to put this in a sworn statement? Bianca looked at her rings, then at Walsh, then at Valentina. Yes, she said. After Bianca left, Valentina sat with the information for a long time. Lorenzo had always been a strategist. She had known this. It was one of the things she had initially found compelling about him. The quality of his thinking, the way he played 4 moves ahead. She had not understood until now exactly how far ahead he had been playing with her. He had married her knowing about the Bellarosa bloodline, or suspecting enough to be interested. He had stayed through the pregnancy because the children represented an access point he couldn't get otherwise. He had begun building the legal case against her as cover for an exit strategy that had nothing to do with courts. And then Matteo had appeared, and the federal investigation had begun, and Bianca had sat in a hotel room and done the math on what she was actually part of, and the whole architecture had started coming apart. Matteo came at 6 in the evening. He didn't ask how the conversation with Lorenzo had gone, which told her he already knew. She had stopped being surprised by how much he already knew. The federal investigators, she said. How involved are they actually? Very, he sat. Lorenzo has been under investigation for 14 months. Money laundering primarily through 4 shell companies connected to his real estate holdings. The investigation was proceeding slowly because he's careful and he has people inside who warn him when pressure is building. A pause. 2 of those people have been reassigned. By you. He didn't answer, which was an answer. What does that mean for the custody case, she said. It means that Lorenzo's legal team is going to be increasingly occupied with his criminal exposure. It means Harlow is likely going to prioritize keeping Lorenzo out of federal custody over fighting a custody battle that's already going badly. He looked at her. It also means Lorenzo is going to become more desperate, not less. Men like him don't accept the contraction of their options gracefully. I know. She looked at the window. He came this morning. I know. He didn't answer my question about your family. He wouldn't. Admitting knowledge of the Bellarosa name in front of you is admitting the motive behind the custody strategy. His lawyers would have told him never to say it directly. He said he'd heard rumors. Before the marriage? Yes, Matteo was quiet for a moment. That's probably true. There are people in certain circles who knew your mother's history. Lorenzo would have had access to that information, if he wanted it. He would have had it confirmed before he approached you. The word approached, like she had been a target, like the gala had been deliberate. He chose me, she said. Not a question, just saying it out loud. He identified you as a potential connection to Bellarosa assets and influence, yes. Matteo's voice was steady but not unkind. Whether anything else was genuine, I can't tell you. I didn't know him before you married him. She thought about Lorenzo at that gala, certain magnetic, looking at her like she was the only person in the room. She thought about how that had felt. She thought about the fact that she might never know how much of it was real. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could live with not knowing. She had more urgent things to know. What do I need to prepare for? She said. Lorenzo is going to make one more move before his illegal situation makes further moves impossible. Matteo looked at her directly. I don't know yet what form it will take. He's operating without most of his inner circle. At this point, two key lieutenants are cooperating with the federal investigation. His financial director resigned 3 days ago. His primary attorney is advising him to settle everything and focus on his criminal defense. He paused. That leaves him with fewer resources and more desperation, which is a specific and dangerous combination. So we wait for him to do something. We prepare for him to do something. There's a difference. She nodded. On the 8th day after delivery, she was discharged. Her sons were not. They needed another 12 days in the NICU. The attending told her before they'd be stable enough for home. She could visit twice daily, as long as she needed, for as long as she needed to stay. She understood this, and she understood also that leaving the hospital meant leaving the particular cocoon of the last 8 days, the monitored and managed world of nurses and legal orders, and the physical distance from her ordinary life. She was going back into a city where Lorenzo Vescari was increasingly cornered and increasingly unpredictable. Nina helped her dress that morning. Simple clothes, the loose, practical things that had been packed in her hospital bag, things that accounted for the reality of a postpartum body and the limitations of a recovering incision. Nina zipped the back of her jacket and stood back and looked at her. "You look like yourself," Nina said, "just angrier." "I'm not angry." Nina raised one eyebrow. "I'm not angry," Valentina said again. "Anger is for people who have extra energy. I'm focused." "What's the difference?" "Anger wants to burn something. Focus wants to build something." Nina looked at her for a moment. "When did you get like this?" Somewhere around the 3rd signature on the divorce papers. The car Matteo sent was black, unremarkable, driven by a man named Carver, who said almost nothing and drove with the particular alertness of someone who was paid to anticipate problems rather than react to them. There was a second car behind them. Valentina noticed it and didn't comment, because asking Matteo to explain his security arrangements would be like asking water to explain being wet. The house on the North Shore was not what she expected. She had been imagining something that announced itself, the kind of property that powerful men used to demonstrate that they were powerful men. What she got instead was a large, plain house on 2 acres, set back from the road, with mature trees on 3 sides and a view of the lake from the upper floors. It was furnished simply, with the kind of furniture that had been chosen for comfort rather than impression. There were fresh flowers in the kitchen, which was the only touch that suggested someone had anticipated her specifically. There was a bedroom prepared for her. There was a room beside it set up as a nursery, which she stood in the doorway of for a long time without going in. Carla was there. Her housekeeper she hadn't known. Matteo had contacted Carla, hadn't known Carla had agreed, hadn't known any of this was being arranged while she was still in the hospital. Carla was standing in the kitchen when Valentina walked in, and she looked at her with the expression of a woman who had worked 8 years in a house that had never quite been a home and was very glad to be out of it. "I brought the things from the nursery," Carla said. "From the house. Mr. Vescari's attorney called to say we weren't permitted to remove personal property, so I explained that infants' belongings are the property of their mother, not their father. And then I left." She set a pot of coffee on the counter with a decisive thunk. "There's soup. Sit down." Valentina sat down. She ate the soup and drank the coffee and let Carla talk about small logistical things. And outside the kitchen window, the lake was gray and flat in the October afternoon. And she thought about her sons and about what Matteo had said and about Lorenzo somewhere in the city deciding what his next move was going to be. She didn't have to wait long to find out. The call came at 11 that night. She was in bed, not sleeping. Her body was exhausted, but her mind was doing the particular thing it did when she'd been given too much to process, cycling through scenarios and implications and things she should have said and things she still needed to do. Her phone was on the nightstand. She looked at the number. "Lorenzo," she answered. "I know where you are," he said. No greeting. His voice was different from that morning at the hospital. Something had gone out of the careful management of it. She sat up in the dark. "Then you know I'm not alone," she said. "Bellarosa can't protect you forever. He's not going to spend the rest of his life on your problem. He seems pretty committed. You don't know what you're in the middle of." His voice tightened. "You think he showed up out of family feeling? You think this is about your mother?" Matteo Bellarosa has been fighting a territorial dispute with 3 other families for 2 years. He needs the Bellarosa bloodline, legitimized through your children, to consolidate his position. You're not protected. You're being used. She sat with that for a moment. She didn't say, "You would know a lot about using people." She didn't say, "You're going to have to do better than this." She said nothing, because sometimes silence does more damage than words. Valentina, his voice shifted, lower. Something in it she hadn't heard before, or hadn't heard in so long she'd forgotten it was in there. "I made mistakes, I know that. The hospital, the way I handled things, I know what that looked like. But what I'm telling you right now is the truth. Matteo is not what he's presenting himself as." "Interesting," she said carefully. "Don't do this alone. Don't trust him blindly. Please." The please surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she had heard him say please and mean it. "Are you scared, Lorenzo?" she asked. He didn't answer. "Are you scared of what's coming?" she said quietly. "Not of Matteo. Of the investigation. Of what your own people are saying to the federal attorneys right now." His breathing changed on the line. "Don't do anything until we talk in person," he said. "I'm not going to meet you. I need you to hear." "I heard you in that hallway on Michigan Avenue," she said. "I heard everything. I'm done hearing you." She ended the call. She sat in the dark for a long time after. She thought about what he'd said about Matteo. She turned it over carefully, the way you turn a stone you've just picked up, not because you're sure there's something under it, but because you need to check. Matteo had resources. Matteo had moved quickly. Matteo had a property ready and a driver and Carla relocated and a surgical team on retainer and a legal team in motion and a federal investigation either coincidentally underway or nudged in a specific direction at a specific time. Lorenzo was a liar. She knew this. It was not neutral information. But liars sometimes say true things. She needed to ask Matteo about the territorial dispute. Directly. Tomorrow. And she needed to watch his face when she asked. She lay back down. She did not sleep for a long time. "In the morning," she asked. Matteo was at the kitchen table with coffee when she came downstairs, which meant he had either stayed overnight or arrived very early, and she chose not to ask which. She poured her own coffee and sat across from him. "Lorenzo called last night," she said. His expression didn't change, which itself told her something. "He said, 'You're using my son's bloodline to consolidate your position against competing families,'" she said. "That your interest in protecting us is about territorial politics, not family feeling." Matteo looked at her steadily. "Is any part of that true?" she said. He picked up his cup, set it down. "Yes," he said. She had braced for a denial. The honesty landed harder than a denial would have. "Tell me," she said. He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, but the quiet of someone choosing how to say a true thing as accurately as they can. "There is a dispute. Two families who believe that the Bellarosa network, without a clear succession line, is vulnerable. They're right. Your son's existence, the legitimacy of the bloodline changes that calculation." He looked at her. "That is true, and is that why you're here?" "It's part of why I'm here." He met her eyes. "The other part is that you're Elisa's daughter. And I let Elisa walk out of my life because she asked me to, and she died without me knowing her, and I can't fix that." His voice didn't break, but it came close not in an emotional display way, but in the way of something very tightly held. "I can't fix that, but I can make sure what she tried to protect doesn't get destroyed by a man who married her daughter as a business calculation." The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the lake was there, flat and gray. "You're asking me to trust someone with complicated motivations," she said. "Everyone has complicated motivations," Matteo said. "The question is whether the complications point in the same direction as your interests." She thought about it. "And if they stop pointing in the same direction?" "Then you'll know," he said, "and you'll have the resources by then to do something about it." She sat with that for a long time. She thought about her 3 sons 12 days from coming home. She thought about a house she hadn't chosen, but that had flowers in the kitchen. She thought about Carla with the soup and Walsh with the folder, and the custody order that was holding for now, and the federal investigation that was tightening around Lorenzo like something inexorable. She thought about her mother, 22 years old, walking away from all of this. She thought about herself 30 years later, sitting in the middle of all of this anyway. And then Walsh called. She could tell from his voice before he said a word. "What happened?" she said. "Lorenzo's team filed an emergency motion this morning," Walsh said. "New grounds. They've submitted documentation claiming that your association with Matteo Bellarosa constitutes voluntary immersion in a criminal environment, and that housing the children in a property connected to organized crime is a per se harm." His voice was controlled but tight. They also filed a motion to have Matteo Bellarosa's financial connection to your legal representation disclosed, arguing conflict of interest. She looked at Matteo across the table. He was watching her. Can they do that? She said into the phone. They can file it. Whether a judge takes it seriously is another question. But Val, there's something else. She waited. The documentation they submitted. It includes photographs, surveillance photographs taken outside this house last night. A pause. They know exactly where you are. They've been watching since you were discharged. Valentina set down her coffee cup. She looked out the window at the gray lake and the mature trees on three sides, and the house she had thought was private and safe and unremarked upon. And she understood, with the cold clarity that had been her operating mode for the past 9 days, that nothing about this situation was going to be resolved by patience or legal maneuvering or even Matteo's calls. Lorenzo had surveillance on her location. He had attorneys filing emergency motions at 8 in the morning. He was cornered and running out of moves, and a cornered man with nothing left to lose was about to do something that no amount of preparation was going to fully anticipate. She had run out of time to think. She had to move. Walsh, she said, I need you to file a counter motion by noon. Everything we have, Bianca's statement, the documentation of the hospital flag, the timeline of the custody filing relative to my hemorrhage, all of it. Her voice was even. Completely even. And I need it filed before Lorenzo's people can respond. That's aggressive, yes. A pause. Okay, I'll need until 1. Noon. Walsh made a sound that was not quite agreement, but would have to serve. She ended the call. She looked at Matteo. Your surveillance, she said. The perimeter security. How long have they been watching us? Since yesterday evening. And they saw Lorenzo's people watching. Yes, and you didn't tell me. He held her gaze. I was going to tell you this morning. You should have told me last night. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped.
We're going to be clear about one thing right now.
I don't operate on information you've decided I'm ready for. I operate on information, period. If you can't do that, then we have a much bigger problem than Lorenzo. Matteo looked at her for a long moment. Understood, he said. Good. She pushed back her chair. Now tell me everything you know about what Lorenzo is planning, and don't leave anything out. This is a work of complete fiction created for dramatic entertainment. All characters, organizations, and events are entirely imaginary. Matteo told her everything. It took 40 minutes. He talked the way he did everything else without embellishment, without the softening language people use when they're trying to make bad information easier to receive. He told her about Lorenzo's remaining resources, 2 lieutenants who hadn't flipped yet, a separate financial account held under a corporate entity in Delaware that the federal investigation hadn't located yet, and a contact inside the Cook County family court system who had been accepting payments from Lorenzo's operation for 3 years. That last one stopped her. A judge, she said. A clerk. A senior one. With significant influence over case assignment. Matteo's hands were flat on the table. Walsh's counter motion is going to be filed with whoever is on rotation today. There's a probability, not a certainty, but a real probability that it lands with a judge whose clerk has already been spoken to. She processed this. Then Walsh needs to know. I'm calling him after this conversation. No. She pushed her chair back. I'm calling him. Right now. You don't mediate my legal team. She looked at him steadily. This is what I mean about information, Matteo. You knew about the clerk. When did you know? He didn't answer immediately. Yesterday, he said. She picked up her phone and called Walsh without saying anything further to Matteo, because there was nothing to say that wouldn't cost her time she didn't have. Walsh answered on the second ring, and she told him about the clerk, and Walsh was quiet for 4 seconds she counted, and then he said he needed to reroute the filing through an emergency motion to a specific appellate track that would bypass the standard clerk's assignment, which was possible but would take until 2 o'clock, not noon. 2 o'clock, she said, do it. She ended the call. Matteo was watching her. I need everything you know, immediately, without me having to extract it, she said. That's not negotiable, agreed, he said. For the second time in 2 days, without qualification. She wasn't sure yet if that meant she could trust him. But it meant she could work with him, which was what she needed right now. Carver drove her to the hospital at 10 for her morning visit to the NICU. The second car followed. She watched the rearview mirror the whole way, and Carver said nothing about it, which she appreciated. Her sons were doing better. The attending used words like encouraging and on track with the cautious optimism of someone who meant them, but was too experienced to commit fully. The smallest of the three, she had begun calling him Marco in her head, though she hadn't named them officially yet, not without holding them properly, had been moved off one of his monitors. His color was better. When she put her finger against his palm, he gripped it with the specific blind insistence of a newborn who has no philosophy about the world yet, only instinct. She stayed for 90 minutes. She talked to them while she was there. She hadn't planned to, it felt strange, talking to people who couldn't respond, and she had always found the practice a little performative when she saw other parents do it. But she found herself doing it anyway, not for their benefit but for hers, because the sound of her own voice in that room, saying ordinary things, "You're doing well," "You three, you scared me," but "you're doing well" was the only thing that made the rest of the morning feel manageable. She was in the NICU hallway putting her coat back on when Nina called. "Lorenzo is at your old house," Nina said, without greeting. Nina had learned over the past 10 days that greetings were a luxury. "He showed up an hour ago. Carla's contacts told me. He can be at the house. The house is still legally his pending settlement." Nina's voice had a specific texture that Valentina had learned to read over 20 years of friendship. It was the texture of someone who has more to say and is deciding how. He's not alone. He has people with him. Not lawyers. People. Valentina stood in the hallway and felt something shift in the atmosphere of the morning. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. They're moving things." "What things?" A pause. "Carla's contact says they're going through the nursery room. The ones you'd set up. The furniture is still there. You took the personal things, the clothes, and the small stuff, but the furniture is there. They're photographing it. Documentation. He was building a physical record of a nursery that she no longer had access to, in a house she no longer lived in, to support the argument that the children had a prepared home waiting for them with their father. It was, she thought, the move of a man who was running out of better moves. "Call Carla's contact back," Valentina said. "I want to know if they take anything." She called Matteo from the car. "I know," he said when he answered. 2 words that were starting to feel like his standard opening. "Then why didn't you? I called Carver 2 minutes ago." "Check your phone." She checked. A text from Carver's number, activity at residence, monitoring. Sent 11 minutes ago, before Nina called. She put the phone back to her ear. "What are they taking from the house?" she said. "Nothing yet. They're there for documentation," which is what I assumed. A pause. Lorenzo got an emergency hearing. The car was moving north on Lakeshore Drive. She watched the lake go past the window, gray and enormous and entirely indifferent. "When this afternoon?" 3 o'clock. The clerk assigned it, yes. Walsh's counterfiling at 2 o'clock. Lorenzo's emergency hearing at 3. The timing was not accidental. Lorenzo's team had known about the o'clock window and had moved to get in front of it. "Walsh can get our counter motion heard at the same time," she said. "Consolidated, that's what I'd recommend. Then I need you to stop recommending and start making calls." Her voice was flat. "I'll talk to Walsh. You handle whatever you handle. But Lorenzo has a 5-hour head start on us today, and I'm done letting that stand." She called Walsh. Walsh had already heard about the hearing from his own sources, which meant this situated sources she didn't know about, and was filtering information on timelines she wasn't aware of. And the particular anger of that was something she was going to have to set aside right now, because anger wasn't useful and focused was. Walsh said the consolidated hearing was possible, but required a specific procedural filing she hadn't authorized yet. She authorized it. Walsh said he'd need to be at the courthouse by 1:30. She said she'd be there. Walsh said that was not advisable given the security situation. She said she'd be there anyway. She was there. She arrived at the Cook County Courthouse at 1:40 in a black coat that was not her best coat, but was the one she could get on without help. With Walsh beside her and Carver behind her, and a second Bellarosa man, she hadn't been introduced to taking up a position near the main entrance with the practiced invisibility of someone who did this for a living. The courthouse lobby was the particular Chicago government building version of institutional marble floors, worn smooth fluorescent lights, the permanent smell of old paper and human waiting. She had been in this building twice before, once for a zoning dispute with a contractor, once for a friend's uncontested divorce hearing. She had never been here for anything that mattered to her this much. Lorenzo was already in the hallway outside courtroom 7. He was with Harlow and a younger attorney. She didn't recognize someone new, brought in for the emergency hearing, someone who looked sharp and expensive and hadn't yet been exposed to the particular experience of being on the wrong side of a situation that had Matteo Bellarosa's attention. Lorenzo saw her from 30 feet away. He looked at her like she was something he was calculating. She looked back at him like he was something she had already calculated. They did not speak. There was a bench between them, a water fountain, 20 feet of public hallway, and 4 years of marriage, and none of it was bridgeable right now by anything either of them could say. The hearing took 52 minutes. The judge was a woman in her 60s named Calloway, with close-cropped gray hair and reading glasses she used constantly, in a manner that suggested she had been on the bench long enough to have seen every version of every argument she was currently hearing, and was primarily interested in which version was better supported. Lorenzo's attorney, the new one, whose name was Kessler, opened with the organized crime environment argument. He was smooth about it. Valentina would give him that. He framed it not as an attack on Valentina's character, but as a concern about circumstance, a mother, recovering from a traumatic delivery, who had voluntarily placed herself in close proximity to a known organized crime figure with an active federal file, in a property connected to criminal enterprise, with security personnel on the premises whose backgrounds and methods were not transparent to the court. It was framed that way, almost sympathetic to Valentina. Almost. Walsh's response was not smooth. Walsh was not a smooth attorney, he was a precise one, which was different and Valentina had decided more valuable. He introduced Bianca's sworn statement, the documented timeline of the custody filing relative to the medical emergency, the hospital administrative flag and its connection to Lorenzo's legal team, and a financial forensics summary prepared, she would learn afterward, by a Bellarosa-connected firm that had been working on it for 8 days, documenting Lorenzo's shell company structure and its connection to the Delaware account the federal investigation hadn't found yet. That last document made Kessler go very still. Harlow leaned toward Kessler and said something into his ear. Judge Calloway looked at the document over her reading glasses. Then she looked at Walsh, counsel, the source of this financial analysis. An independent forensic accounting firm retained by my client, Walsh said. I can provide their credentials. And the Delaware entity, referenced on page 4, is the subject of a supplementary filing I'll have to the court by end of business today. Calloway looked at the document for another moment. Then she looked at Lorenzo. Lorenzo was sitting very still. It was the stillness of a man watching something happen that he doesn't have a move to counter, which was, Valentina's understood, an experience Lorenzo Vescari was not accustomed to. Calloway denied the emergency motion. She did not rule on Walsh's counterfiling, citing the need for additional review of the forensic documentation, but she issued a temporary order confirming Valentina's primary custody status and restricting Lorenzo's access to the children to supervised visitation pending the full hearing. Supervised visitation. Valentina sat with that for a moment. It was not everything. It was not the end of it, but it was a wall between Lorenzo and her sons, and right now a wall was what she needed most. In the hallway after, Lorenzo came toward her. Harlow said something to him. He ignored it. He walked toward her with the particular focus of a man who has made a decision, and Carver moved not dramatically, but moved, putting himself in the space between them, and Lorenzo stopped. They were 8 feet apart. This is a mistake, Lorenzo said. Not loud. Not a threat, exactly, or not only a threat. Something more complicated, what you're doing. The path you're on. You don't understand the consequences of this. Which consequences, she said. The ones where my sons are safe, or the ones where you're in federal custody? His jaw tightened. I tried to talk to you last night, he said. I tried to warn you. You tried to scare me. She kept her voice level. You told me Matteo was using me. Maybe he is, partly. But you were using me completely and for longer, so I'll take partly. Something moved through his face, not quite guilt, not quite anger. Something that didn't have a clean name. Valentina. Her name and his voice, the way he said it, had always done something to her. She had told herself it was love for a long time. She understood now it was familiarity, which is what love turns into when love was never really the thing. You know what I'm capable of. I know exactly what you're capable of, she said. I've watched you for 4 years. I was in that hallway on Michigan Avenue. I was in this courthouse today. She held his gaze. I know. She walked away. She did not look back. She was in Carver's car heading north when Walsh called. She thought it was about the hearing follow-up. She answered with that assumption, which meant the thing he said didn't land with the weight it deserved about 4 seconds, and then it landed entirely. The forensic document, Walsh said. The Delaware entity. Valentina, one of the signatories on the corporate filing, is Matteo Bellarosa. She didn't say anything. His name is on the paperwork, Walsh said. It's a shell company. It's connected to Lorenzo's money laundering operation, but Matteo's signature is on the founding documents. From 6 years ago. 6 years ago, before Lorenzo and Valentina had met, before the marriage and the pregnancy and any of this, she kept her eyes on the road outside the window. Are you saying Matteo and Lorenzo have a business connection? Had. 6 years ago. It might be defunct now, I don't know yet. But that document I submitted to the court, I didn't know his name was in it. The forensic firm gave it to me this morning and I filed it. I didn't read every page. Walsh's voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort of the control. I'm sorry, I should have read every page. Does Kessler know? She said. He will by end of business today. When Harlow sees the full document, they'll see it. She thought about what that meant. Lorenzo's team was going to present to the court that Valentina's primary protector, the man providing her housing, her legal funding, her security, had a documented business relationship with Lorenzo's criminal enterprise 6 years prior. That the woman arguing she was fleeing organized crime was in fact protected by someone with an established connection to organized crime, connected specifically to the financial network, now under federal investigation. It would not destroy the custody case, but it would muddy it severely. And it would give Harlow exactly the argument he'd been trying to build, that Valentina's environment was compromised, that Matteo's protection was not protection at all, that the organized crime angle ran through both sides of this conflict, and the children were caught in the middle. She ended the call with Walsh. She did not call Matteo. She sat in the moving car and looked at the lake and thought very carefully. Matteo's signature on founding documents of a shell company connected to Lorenzo's operation. 6 years ago, before Valentina was ever in the picture. 2 interpretations. First, Matteo and Lorenzo had a business relationship that Matteo had never disclosed. A relationship that predated the marriage, that Matteo had covered up, and that meant his arrival at the hospital 11 days ago, was not the coincidence it had appeared, was in fact connected to Lorenzo in ways she didn't understand yet. Second, Lorenzo had used Matteo's name without his knowledge. It was possible to place a name on founding documents without that person's awareness, if you had access to enough personal information. A forged signature. A name used without consent. She didn't know which was true. She didn't know how to find out quickly. She did know that she was in a house belonging to Matteo Bellarosa, with Matteo Bellarosa's security around her, with her legal representation funded by Matteo Bellarosa, and that she had, in the past 11 days, given him a significant amount of trust, not blindly, not without conditions, but significantly. And she needed to know right now whether that trust had been a catastrophic mistake. Carver pulled into the driveway of the North Shore house. Matteo's car was already there. Of course it was. She got out without waiting for Carver to open the door. She walked into the house through the front entrance and found Matteo in the main room, standing at the window with his phone in his hand, which told her he'd already heard. She stopped in the middle of the room. "Tell me about the Delaware company," she said. He turned. His face was doing something she hadn't seen on it before. Not guilt, not exactly. The face of a man who has arrived at a conversation he knew was coming and has decided not to try to manage it. "Sit down," he said. "No." He looked at her for a moment. Then he put the phone in his pocket and stood straight and told her. 6 years ago, Lorenzo Vescari had approached Matteo through an intermediary. The approach had been framed as a legitimate real estate investment opportunity in the Chicago market. Matteo had reviewed the initial proposal and allowed his name to be placed on founding documents for what appeared, at that stage, to be a standard holding company. He had not invested capital. He had provided his name as a founding partner for credibility, for the legal protection a Bellarosa name provided in certain circles, in exchange for what he had been told was a minority equity position. He had pulled out within 8 months. He had had the name removed from active documentation. Or he had believed the name had been removed. "You didn't know Lorenzo had kept the original filing," Valentina said. "I discovered it 14 months ago, when the federal investigation began and I was made aware of the company through my own sources." He held her gaze. At that point, I understood that Lorenzo had made a document with my name on it as insurance, as leverage. Against you. Against me, yes. And against anyone I was connected to, he paused. Including potentially you. The room was very quiet. She heard the lake outside distantly through the windows. You knew about this before you came to the hospital, she said. Yes. You knew Lorenzo had documentation connecting you to his shell company. Yes. And you decided not to tell me.
I decided it was better.
Don't. Her voice was very quiet. Don't tell me what you decided it was better to do. Tell me what you were protecting. He was quiet for a moment. Myself, he said, and you. In that order, if I'm being honest. She had asked him to be honest. She couldn't take it back now just because honesty was inconvenient. If this comes out in the custody hearing, she said, Harlow will use it to argue that I'm surrounded by people connected to Lorenzo's criminal network. That there's no clean side to this situation. That my son should be in state protective custody pending investigation of both households. That's the argument he'll make, yes. Which means the Bellarosa protection becomes the weapon they use against me. In the short term. There is no long term if I lose custody of my sons in the short term. Her voice didn't rise. It dropped. Lower and lower, the way cold water drops when it gets colder, becoming more itself, not less. How many other things do you know that you've decided I don't need to know? Nothing material to. How many other things? He stopped. Looked at her. The look of a man being asked a question he could answer correctly or usefully, and understanding that in this case only one of those options was available. There are conversations between Lorenzo and 2 federal agents that my sources have obtained, he said. Lorenzo is cooperating. Partially. He's been feeding the investigation enough to protect himself from the worst charges while keeping his core operation intact. The 2 lieutenants who appeared to flip one of them is feeding information back to Lorenzo about the investigation's progress. The floor moved. Not literally. But the thing she had built her current understanding on the shape of what was happening, who was where, what was moving, shifted its foundation. Lorenzo was cooperating with the federal investigation while simultaneously managing it. He had an informant inside the process that appeared to be tightening around him. The investigation that Matteo had positioned as Lorenzo's undoing was something Lorenzo was actively shaping. He's playing both sides, she said. He's been playing both sides for 14 months. And the federal investigators don't know. Not yet. Matteo. She said his name the way you say something that you need to stop the room. If Lorenzo is managing the investigation, then the investigation isn't actually going to bring him down. Everything you told me about his empire collapsing is still true. His financial situation is genuinely dire. His inner circle has genuinely fractured. The investigation is real and it is damaging. He looked at her directly. But it is not going to move as fast as I told you it would. And he has more room to maneuver than I presented. She sat down, not because she wanted to sit, because her legs made the decision before she did. She sat on the edge of the couch in Matteo Bellarosa's North Shore house and looked at the man who was her mother's brother and understood, with a clarity that had the particular cold quality of things that cannot be undone, that she had been making plans on a map that was wrong. The timeline she had imagined Lorenzo collapsing quickly, the custody case resolved, her son's home, the whole thing behind her within weeks was not the timeline she was in. She was in a longer, more complicated timeline, with more moving parts and more competing interests than she had understood. And she was in it with a man who had been withholding material information about the shape of it. What else, she said. What else haven't you told me? He looked at her. Tell me, she said. All of it. Right now. Because I will find out eventually, and every time I find out something you didn't tell me, I trust you less. And if I trust you less than 0, you become a liability, and I will remove you from this situation. Do you understand me? Something moved in his expression that she hadn't seen before. Not surprise exactly. Something more like recognition, the look of a man seeing something he had known, was there but not expected to emerge quite this fully. There's a woman, he said. In Lorenzo's organization. Not Bianca, someone else. She's been in his operation for 3 years. Her name is Elena Voss. Valentina waited. Elena was managing Lorenzo's communications with the Delaware entity. She knows the full scope of the financial operation. And she has documentation, emails, transfer records, a ledger that would be sufficient to not just complicate Lorenzo's position, but to end it. The federal investigation with that documentation becomes a very different case. Where is she? That's the problem. Mateo's voice took on the particular flatness of someone reporting something they find genuinely troubling. Elena Voss has been missing for 72 hours. The number landed in the room and stayed there. 72 hours. 3 days, since before the hospital discharge. Since before Valentina had moved to this house. Did Lorenzo, I don't know. And the way he said it, without hedging, without the management of language he sometimes employed, told her he genuinely didn't know, which was worse than if he'd had an answer. She was supposed to meet with a Belarus contact 4 days ago. She didn't appear. Her apartment is empty. Her phone has been off since Tuesday morning. Tuesday, the day after the hospital discharge. The day Lorenzo had called her at 11 at night and said, "I know where you are." She thought about Lorenzo in the courthouse hallway. You don't understand the consequences of this. She had heard it as a threat directed at her. She had not considered that the consequences he was describing might already be in progress, somewhere else, involving someone else. He knows about Elena, she said, almost certainly. And if Elena Voss is gone, then the documentation is gone with her. Unless she had the sense to leave a copy somewhere. He paused. My people are looking. How long have your people been looking? Since she missed the meeting. 72 hours. Yes, she sat with this. A woman was missing. A woman who held evidence sufficient to end Lorenzo's operation. Who had been in his organization for 3 years, which meant she knew things and had access that took years to accumulate, which meant Lorenzo would have known the same about her, would have known what she could expose, and what it would cost him if she did. The custody hearing was in 3 weeks. Walsh's counter-motion was before the court. The forensic document with Mateo's name was going to reach Harlow by end of business today. And somewhere in this city, a woman named Elena Voss was either hiding or wasn't hiding by her own oints, and either outcome changed the shape of everything. Walsh called again at 4:30. His voice had a quality she had not heard from him before, controlled, but the kind of control that comes just before something breaks through it. Harlow saw the Delaware document, he said. I expected that. He's filed a motion to have Mateo Bellarosa subpoenaed, to appear in the custody hearing and answer questions about his financial relationship with Lorenzo Vescari's criminal enterprise under oath. A beat. Val, if Mateo appears in that courtroom, and it comes out that he has a documented connection to Lorenzo's financial network, the court is going to view this as 2 organized crime interests fighting over children. That is the absolute worst framing for our case. I know. Which means Mateo cannot appear in that courtroom. Which means he has to either comply with the subpoena or challenge it. Challenging it takes time we don't have. She stood up. She walked to the window where Mateo had been standing when she came in. The lake was going gray in the late afternoon. The light changing the way Chicago light changed in October, fast, decisive, committed to the dark. If Mateo complies with the subpoena, she said, thinking out loud, what does he say? The truth. That his name was placed on founding documents without his knowledge, or with his knowledge but without active involvement in the criminal operation. Either version is hard to prove quickly in a custody hearing context. And if he can produce evidence that his name was used fraudulently, that would change the argument significantly. But that's documentation Lorenzo's people are going to contest, and we're 3 weeks from the hearing in. Walsh stopped. Valentina, there's something else. She had started to hate those words. The judge today. Calloway. His voice was precise, careful, the way someone sounds when they're reading from notes because they want to be accurate. Her clerk, the clerk Mateo's information identified as connected to Lorenzo's operation, filed a written complaint this afternoon, alleging that your legal team made improper ex parte contact prior to the filing this morning. She turned from the window. We didn't make any ex parte contact. I know that. But the complaint has been filed and it has to be responded to, which means Calloway has to recuse herself from ruling on our counter motion pending review of the complaint. The case gets reassigned. He paused. The reassignment goes through standard rotation. The clerk who manages reassignment is the same clerk. Yes, the full architecture of it became visible to her. In that moment, not the individual pieces which she had been seeing for days, but the whole shape. Lorenzo wasn't fighting her in the obvious ways. He was fighting in the spaces between the obvious things, corrupting the infrastructure of the process, so that every move she made landed in a slightly wrong place and produced a slightly wrong result. He had been doing this for weeks. He was still doing it. and she had been 3 steps behind the entire time. She thought about Elena Voss, missing for 72 hours. The woman with the ledger, the emails, the transfer records the complete documentation that would make all of this moot, that would take the question of Lorenzo's credibility before any court and answer it permanently and completely. She thought about the house her sons were in the NICU, the incubators, 12 more days before discharge. 12 days during which Lorenzo's team was to keep filing, keep manipulating, keep pressuring the infrastructure of the process. She thought about Matteo behind her now, in this room. She thought about her mother, 22 years old, walking away. She had spent her entire adult life, she understood, trying to build the kind of life her mother had wanted, for her quiet, clean clear of all of this. And she had walked straight into the center of all of it anyway, and now she was standing in a room with evidence of manipulation at every level and a missing witness and a corrupted process, and a man who was supposed to protect her, who had his own connections to the thing he was protecting her from. She turned from the window. She looked at Matteo. "I need to find Elena Voss," she said. "My people are not your people." Her voice was absolutely flat. I need to find her. I need to talk to her myself without anyone's intermediary. Because Elena Voss is the only person in this situation who might tell me the truth about everything about Lorenzo's, about the operation, and about you. She held his gaze. "And if what she tells me changes what I know about you, Matteo, then you're going to find out very quickly that I am not my mother." The room was very still. Outside, the lake went on being the lake, vast and cold and entirely without interest in what was happening in the house at its edge. Matteo looked at her for a long time. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and set a folded piece of paper on the table between them. An address, written by hand. "I found her this morning," he said. "She contacted me last night through a channel I didn't know she had access to, which means Lorenzo gave it to her at some point, which means the nature of their relationship is more complicated than I told you." He looked at her steadily. "She's at that address. She's frightened and she's not going to talk to my people. But she might talk to you." Valentina picked up the paper. She looked at the address. She looked at the man across from her. "Why didn't you tell me this morning?" she said. "Because I needed to understand the scope of what she knows before I put you in the same room with her. And now? Now I think the scope of what she knows might be the only thing that saves you," he said. "And I think you already know that, which is why you asked for her before I told you she existed." She folded the paper. She put it in her coat pocket. "Get me a car that isn't yours," she said. "This is a work of complete fiction created for dramatic entertainment. All characters, organizations, and events are entirely imaginary." The car Matteo arranged was a plain gray sedan registered to a name she didn't recognize, driven by a woman which surprised her, though she didn't say so, named Rose, who was compact and somewhere in her 40s, and drove with the same quality of calibrated alertness as Carver, but without Carver's silence. Rose said, as Valentina got in, "I know where we're going. Matteo told me the address. You want me to wait outside or come in?" "Wait outside." That was the full extent of their conversation for the 40-minute drive. The address on the paper was a neighborhood on the northwest side, not the kind of neighborhood that appeared on restaurant lists or real estate features, just the ordinary Chicago grid of 2 flats and corner stores and streets that went about their business without calling attention to themselves. The specific building was a 3-story walk-up with a buzzer panel and a broken light above the entrance that nobody had gotten around to fixing. Valentina buzzed apartment 2C along silence. "Then who is it?" A woman's voice. Tight with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite calm. "Valentina Vescari." She used the name deliberately, the married name, the name that would mean something to Elena Voss. "I'm alone." Another silence, longer. The door buzzed open. The stairwell smelled of old cooking and something chemical cleaning product or paint, or both. Valentina climbed slowly because her incision was still a presence she had to negotiate with. A sharp reminder every time she moved too fast that her body had done something enormous 12 days ago and was not finished telling her about it. She held the railing. 2nd floor, apartment 2C at the end of the hall, door already open 3 inches, a strip of light and a woman's eye visible in the gap. "Let me see your phone," Elena Voss said. Valentina held it up. "Turn it off." She powered it down. The door opened. Elena Voss was 34, maybe 35. It was hard to tell because she looked like someone who hadn't slept in 4 days, which she probably hadn't. She was angular, dark-eyed, with the kind of face that would be striking under normal circumstances and was currently just bare, stripped of anything that wasn't essential. She was wearing jeans and a heavy sweater, and she was holding a coffee mug in both hands, the way people hold things when their hands need something to do. The apartment was small. A couch, a table with a laptop, and 3 paper cups and a phone charger plugged into the wall with no phone attached to it. Blackout curtains on the windows closed. A duffel bag near the door, packed and ready, the way you pack when you might need to leave in under a minute. Elena looked at Valentina's midsection at the residual shape of a woman 12 days postpartum, and something moved through her expression. "You just had the babies," she said. "Yes. And you're here." "Yes." Elena turned and walked to the table and set down her mug and stood there with her back to Valentina for a moment. When she turned around, her face had settled into something more decided. "Matteo told you I have documentation," she said. "He told me you have a ledger. Emails, transfer records. Did he tell you what's in them?" "He told me it would end Lorenzo's operation." Elena made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "It would end more than Lorenzo's operation." She looked at Valentina directly. "Sit down. This is going to take a few minutes, and you look like you shouldn't be standing." Valentina sat. Elena pulled the chair from the table and sat across from her, close enough that she didn't have to speak loudly, which was deliberate. She was keeping her voice contained, even inside 4 walls with blackout curtains. "I've been inside Lorenzo's financial operation for 3 years, Elena said. "I came in through his real estate division. I'm a forensic accountant originally. I know what money looks like when it's moving in ways it's not supposed to." She paused. "I also know what it looks like when it's moving on behalf of multiple parties." "Multiple parties," Valentina said. "Lorenzo's shell company networked the Delaware entity. The 4 holding companies under it was never just Lorenzo's." Elena watched her face. "It was a joint operation, built to move money for 2 families simultaneously, with Lorenzo as the visible layer and the second party holding a position so clean it doesn't appear in any document that a standard investigation would reach." Valentina felt the specific cold of something she had been circling without knowing it. "Who is the second party?" she said. Elena looked at her for a moment. "Matteo Bellarosa," she said. "Not a forged signature. Not a name used without consent. An active partnership structured specifically so that Matteo's involvement could be excised from any document trail on short notice, while Lorenzo took the full legal exposure." She reached to the laptop and turned it to face Valentina. On the screen was a spreadsheet dense, columns of figures and codes and dates, and in the upper right corner of one sheet, a name. "That's Matteo's account number. Receiving transfers from the Delaware entity on a quarterly basis for 4 years." Valentina looked at the screen. She looked at the number. She thought about Matteo's hands flat on the table that morning. His voice, saying yes when she asked if Lorenzo's claim was partly true. Partly. That word. Partly. She thought about the photograph of her mother, laughing, young, free. She thought about "I let her go because she asked me to." She thought about a house prepared 3 weeks in advance. A surgical team on retainer. A property on the North Shore. Security on the perimeter. She thought about being moved into the center of a protected space by a man who had reasons she hadn't fully understood to want her in the center of a protected space, not just family feeling, not just guilt about her mother, but financial interest. The Bellarosa bloodline in her sons was worth something to both sides of this operation. Matteo protecting Valentina was Matteo protecting his investment. Matteo keeping Lorenzo from taking the children was Matteo keeping Lorenzo from having sole control of an asset they had been sharing. She had been in between them the entire time, not protected, positioned. Her hands were very still in her lap. "If this is accurate," she said, and her voice was completely level, which surprised even her, then Matteo's motive for appearing at the hospital was not to help me. It was to ensure that the Bellarosa bloodline, my sons, remained accessible to him and not exclusively to Lorenzo. "That's what the numbers say?" Elena confirmed. "And the protection he's providing is real. He doesn't want harm to come to you or the children. But the reason it's real is because harmed children in a federal custody case become wards of the state, which serves neither him nor Lorenzo, and complicates the longer-term financial architecture significantly." She paused. "I'm not saying he doesn't care about you. I genuinely don't know. But I'm saying caring about you and having financial reasons to protect you are not the same thing, and in his case, both are operating simultaneously. Valentina was quiet for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" she said. "You worked for Lorenzo. Why are you sitting in this apartment telling me things that damage both of them?" Elena picked up her mug, set it down without drinking. "Because Lorenzo figured out what I know," she said. "And Lorenzo doesn't leave loose ends." She said it with the flat certainty of someone who has been inside an operation long enough to understand exactly how it handles the things it can't afford to have exist. "And because I have a daughter. She's 9. She lives with her father in Milwaukee, and I have been telling myself for 3 years that what I do here doesn't reach her, that the wall between this life and that life is solid enough." She looked at Valentina. "I'm done believing that." The room was very quiet. "Where is the documentation?" Valentina said. Elena reached into the front pocket of the duffel bag near the door and removed a USB drive. Held it up, everything. The full ledger, 4 years of transfers. Emails between Lorenzo and Matteo establishing the joint structure. A recorded phone call from 8 months ago in which Lorenzo explicitly describes the arrangement and Matteo's role in it. She set the drive on the table between them. "This goes to the federal investigation. The custody court gets notified of the full financial picture involving both parties, and neither of them has a clean position to operate from." "It also implicates you," Valentina said. "Yes." Elena didn't flinch. "I know. You'd go to prison. Maybe. Probably not for long. I have cooperation to offer, and I've been careful about what I touch directly." She looked at Valentina steadily. "But yes, there are consequences for me." Valentina looked at the USB drive on the table. She thought about Walsh, about what this documentation meant for the custody hearing. If both Matteo and Lorenzo were exposed as partners in the same criminal financial network, the court's entire framework shifted. Neither of them could present as a protective presence. The organized crime argument that Harlow had been building against Valentina's association with Matteo, it cut both ways now, and it cut deeper because the connection was not peripheral, but structural. It also meant Valentina's legal funding was connected to criminal proceeds. It also meant the house she was staying in was connected to criminal proceeds. It also meant every layer of protection around her had a financial interest underneath it. She picked up the USB drive. She felt its weight light, almost nothing, a piece of plastic with metal contacts and a casing, no heavier than a coin. The kind of object that shouldn't be able to carry the weight of what it contained. "I need to make a call," she said. "I told you to turn your phone off." "I need to make a call," Valentina said again. Not a request. Elena looked at her. Then she reached into her own pocket and produced a phone, a burner, by the look of it, and held it out. Valentina dialed Walsh from memory. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been waiting. "I need you to contact the federal investigation directly," she said. "Not through any channel connected to Matteo Bellarosa. Your own contact or a direct approach to the U.S. Attorney's office? Can you do that?" "A beat. Yes." "Why? Because I have something they need, and I need to hand it to them in a way that is not filtered through anyone else in this situation." She paused. "And I need to know, if I bring this documentation to the federal investigation and it implicates Matteo as well as Lorenzo, what happens to my custody case?" Walsh was quiet for several seconds. She could hear him thinking. If both primary parties connected to the dispute are under federal investigation, the court typically moves to protect the children through an independent guardian ad litem while the legal situation resolves. It could mean a temporary custody arrangement outside both households. Temporary, weeks, not months, if we move correctly. And with the financial documentation exposing Lorenzo's motive for the custody action, if we can show the custody case was built on a fraudulent premise connected to criminal financial interest, the court is going to look very differently at your position as the mother. He paused again. "Valentina, this could be what wins the whole case. But it means burning Matteo's protection in the process." "I know," she said. She ended the call. She looked at Elena. "I'm going to need you to come with me," she said. "Not to the federal office. To the courthouse first. Walsh needs a statement before we hand anything to anyone. Because once the federal investigation has this, it moves on their timeline, not ours." She stood. "Can you do that?" Elena looked at the duffel bag. She looked at the USB drive in Valentina's hand. "My daughter," she said. "If I do this, Lorenzo's people, I'll get her moved," Valentina said. "Today, before anything is filed." She met Elena's eyes. "I don't have Matteo's resources. But I have Walsh, and I have enough understanding of what Mateo's resources look like to redirect some of them before he realizes what I'm using them for. She paused. Your daughter's name? Cora. Give me the address in Milwaukee. She held out the burner phone. Type it in, then we go. Elena typed the address. They left the apartment. Roz was at the curb, engine running, exactly where she'd said she'd be. Valentina got in the back with Elena and gave Rose the address of Walsh's office downtown and said, fast. Not reckless. Fast. Rose drove. Valentina called Walsh on the burner and gave him Cora's address in Milwaukee and told him to get someone there in the next 2 hours, someone not connected to Mateo. And Walsh said he knew a private security firm he'd used for a domestic case 3 years ago, and he would make the call. Then she powered down the burner. She sat in the moving car and felt her incision and felt the weight of the USB drive in her coat pocket and felt the particular exhaustions of someone who has been running on adrenaline and clarity and something colder than either for 2 weeks, and some whose body is beginning to send signals that the account is nearly empty. She thought about Mateo in the North Shore house, realizing she was gone. She thought about the moment he would understand what she'd done. She thought about her mother and the choice her mother had made at 22, and how completely Valentina had understood that choice, the walking away, the building of a different life, the refusal to carry any of this into the future, and how completely she had ended up in the center of it anyway. The difference was that her mother had been able to walk away clean. Valentina had 3 sons in a NICU. There was no walking away clean. There was only walking through. Walsh's office was on the 11th floor of a building on Michigan Avenue, 3 blocks from the courthouse. He met them at the elevator with a paralegal and a court reporter he'd called in on 40 minutes' notice, which told Valentina something about the kind of lawyer Walsh was when the situation was genuinely urgent. Elena's sworn statement took 70 minutes. Walsh was precise and relentless in the way he questioned, not hostile, not theatrical, but absolutely committed to getting every fact in its exact form, every date, every account number, every name. Elena answered steadily. Twice she had to stop once when the recorder asked her to speak more clearly, and she realized her voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. Once when Walsh produced a printed copy of one of the transfer records and asked her to confirm the account number, and she had to look at it for a long moment before she could speak. When it was done, she signed her name at the bottom of 7 pages. Walsh looked at Valentina. I'm filing this with the U.S. Attorney's Office at 6 o'clock today, he said. I'm also filing a supplementary brief with the custody court first at 5:30, establishing that the forensic documentation previously submitted, the one with Mateo's name, connects both parties to the same criminal financial network, and therefore neither can be considered a neutral protective presence. He paused. The moment I file that brief, Mateo's team is going to know. I know, Valentina. He set down his pen. Are you prepared for what happens when Mateo realizes you've done this? She thought about the question for a moment. He's going to be angry, she said. And then he's going to be rational, because he's a rational man, and rational men understand when a situation has moved past the point where anger is useful. She looked at Walsh. File everything. She left Elena in Walsh's office. Walsh had arranged for her to stay there until Cora was confirmed safe, and until the federal filing gave Elena the procedural protection of an active cooperating witness, and she took Rose in the gray sedan back to the North Shore house, because she needed to face Mateo before he heard from anyone else. She needed to be the one to tell him, not out of courtesy, out of strategy, because the way Mateo processed information he received directly from her was different from the way he would process it through a third party, and the difference mattered. He was in the front room when she walked in, standing. He had known she was coming. Rose's car, the timeline, the fact that she'd been gone 4 hours without contact. He had put the picture together. His face, when she walked in, was the face of a man who has already understood what he is about to be told. You found Elena, he said. Yes. And she gave you the documentation. Yes. And you've given it to Walsh. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. His jaw was very tight. Not rage, she had been ready for rage, had prepared for it, and what she was looking at was something more controlled and more alarming in its way. He was standing very still in the way that people stand when the stillness is costing them something. You understand what this does, he said, to my position, to the people who work under me, to the financial arrangement between you and Lorenzo that you've been running for 4 years while telling me you were here out of family feeling. Her voice was even. It was costing her something too. Yes, I understand. Something moved through his expression. It was both things, he said. I know. Elisa's daughter was not a financial calculation. I know that too. She looked at him steadily. You can hold two motivations at once. Most people can. It doesn't make either of them false. But it makes the whole picture different from what you presented, and I needed the whole picture to make the right decision. She paused. You told me you had complicated motivations. I told you I needed to know if they pointed in the same direction as my interests. Now we know they didn't. Not entirely. He looked at her for a long time. What happens to the children, he said. Practically. In the next 48 hours, Walsh filed a brief establishing that both you and Lorenzo are connected to the same financial network. The court will likely appoint a guardian ad litem and move to a protected custody arrangement temporarily. I'll be the named primary parent with supervised support while the legal situation resolves. She held his gaze. The custody case is survivable. The timeline is longer than I wanted. But Lorenzo's motive for the entire custody action accessing the Bellarosa bloodline through the children for the financial network is now documented and before the court. He'll fight it. He'll fight it from inside a federal investigation that just received documentation of his joint operation with you, said. He doesn't have room to fight anything on multiple fronts simultaneously. His lawyers are going to tell him that. Matteo turned and walked to the window. He stood there looking at the lake. She let him stand there. After a long moment, he said, without turning around, the Delaware account. My quarterly transfers, you saw them. Yes, then you know the total. I know the total. He turned. I want you to know I never touched money that came from. Matteo. She stopped him. Not unkindly. What you did or didn't touch is for the federal investigation to sort out. I'm not a judge. I'm a woman with 3 premature sons who need to come home to a stable situation, and I have done what I needed to do to make that possible. She paused. I'm not angry with you. He looked at her. You're not. No. And she wasn't, which was the thing that surprised her most about the day. She was exhausted and clear and certain and not angry. Anger required a kind of energy she had redistributed into action hours ago. You helped me. The help was complicated and the motivations were mixed. Those things are both true. The outcome of the help, the custody order, the legal protection, the time I needed to find Elena, that's also true. She looked at him steadily. I'm not your enemy, Matteo, but I'm not your asset either. I'm going to spend the rest of this process making sure everyone in this situation understands that. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said something she did not expect. Your mother would have done exactly this, he said. She would have burned it all down and walked out carrying the one thing she came for. He turned back to the window. I should have expected it. She left the room. She called Nina from her own phone, powered back on now, the hour of darkness over. I need somewhere to stay tonight, she said, not here. Nina said, I've had a bag packed for you for a week. Of course she had. It was Nina's kitchen, hands around a cup of tea she was actually drinking this time, when Walsh called at 7:45. The U.S. Attorney's Office received the filing, he said. They've confirmed receipt and assigned a case agent. Elena is officially a cooperating witness. A pause. And Lorenzo's team just contacted me. She put the cup down. Harlow? Not Harlow. Lorenzo directly, through a personal cell number. Walsh's voice was careful. He wants a meeting. Tonight. He says he has something he wants to say to you that can't go through attorneys. She thought about it. Where? He suggested somewhere neutral. A restaurant in the Loop he named. Walsh paused. Valentina, I don't think... What's the name of the restaurant? Walsh gave it to her. She thought about Lorenzo in that courthouse hallway, 8 feet away, the particular quality of his face when he said, you don't understand the consequences of this. She thought about the night phone call, his voice stripped of its management. I tried to warn you. I tried to talk to you. She thought about a man who was watching every lever he'd spent years building get pulled away from him in the space of a week, and who had picked up his personal phone and called his ex-wife's attorney directly. A desperate man. A man who had run out of moves. She thought about what a man like that does when he runs out of moves. Tell him I'll be there, she said. Walsh made a sound that was definitely not agreement. I'll be there with you, he said. No, I'll go alone. That's not Walsh. Her voice was gentle and absolute. I need you at the courthouse filing desk tomorrow morning at 8. I need you sharp and I need you there. I'll handle this. She paused. If I'm not back by 11, then you call whoever you need to call. She ended the call. Nina was looking at her from across the kitchen table. Tell me you're not going to meet him alone, Nina said. I'm going to meet him alone. He's not going to hurt me. She was certain of this. She wasn't certain of many things, but she was certain of this. Lorenzo Vescari was a strategist. Harming her now, with the federal investigation active and Walsh holding a sworn statement from Elena and the documentation already filed, would be the single most self-destructive move available to him. He wasn't stupid. He had never been stupid. He had been calculating and selfish and specifically cruel in the way of someone who treats other people as means rather than ends. But he had never been stupid. He wants to negotiate. Negotiate what? You've already filed everything. He doesn't know the full scope of what I've filed yet. Harlow is going to see it tomorrow morning. She stood up. Which means tonight is the last window he has to offer me something before he knows exactly how little he has left to offer. Nina stared at her. Who are you? She said. Valentina put on her coat. The restaurant was on the ground floor of a hotel in the Loop, the kind of place that was about kind of discretion rather than atmosphere, the kind of tables and lighting chosen specifically to allow people to have conversations that needed to not be overheard. Lorenzo was already there when she arrived, at a table in the back corner, without Harlow, without anyone. Just him. He looked different from the courthouse. He looked different from the hospital. He looked like a man who had stopped managing how he looked, which was more alarming than anything she'd seen on his face before, because Lorenzo Vescari had been managing how he looked for as long as she'd known him, and the cessation of that effort told her something about the state of what was underneath it. She sat across from him without being invited. He looked at her hands, then her face. You found Elena, he said. Yes. And you filed with the federal investigation. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He had a glass of water in front of him, untouched. His hands were on the table, which was uncharacteristic. Lorenzo kept his hands in his lap in meetings, controlled, out of sight. The hands on the table were another sign. I want to know something, he said. And I want you to tell me honestly. I'll try. Was any of it real? From your side, he looked at her directly. The marriage. Did you ever actually? Yes, she said before he finished. For most of it. I wouldn't have stayed otherwise. I'm not a person who stays for a transaction. Something crossed his face. Something she couldn't name. I didn't start as a transaction, he said. She looked at him. I know you suspected the Bellarosa connection before we met, she said. I know the initial approach was deliberate, yes. He didn't look away. But it stopped being only that. He said it carefully, like a man handling something fragile. I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm just saying it's true. It doesn't change anything that happened. I know. It doesn't change the hospital, the papers, the custody filing. Her voice was even. It doesn't change any of it. I know. He picked up the water glass. Set it down. The federal case is going to move on me now. With the full documentation. Harlow is going to tell me tomorrow morning that my exposure is, he stopped. Significant, yes, the custody case is going to resolve in my favor, she said. You know that now, he looked at her. I want access, he said. Not custody. Access, supervised, whatever the court determines. I want to know them, his jaw tightened. Their mind, too. Whatever I did, they didn't do anything. She sat with that for a moment. She thought about 3 faces no larger than her hand. 3 heartbeats she had felt through her palm. 3 boys who would grow up and ask questions and deserve answers she was going to have to figure out how to give. That's not my decision to make unilaterally, she said. That's the court's, and it's going to depend on what the federal case looks like in 6 months. She paused. But I'm not going to tell them you don't exist. I'm not going to make you a ghost. She looked at him steadily. That's the only thing I'll give you tonight. The rest is up to whatever you do next. He once, slowly, like a man closing a door. There's something else, he said. His hand moved to his jacket pocket. He removed a phone, not his regular phone, a second one, and placed it on the table between them. Screen up. On the screen was a message thread. She could see only the top line from where she sat, but the name attached to the thread made her go very still. Matteo, read the last message, Lorenzo said. She looked at him. Read it, he said quietly. She picked up the phone. The last message in the thread was time-stamped 40 minutes ago, sent while she was driving to this restaurant, while Walsh was filing documents, while everything she had done today was already in motion. It was from Matteo's number. It said, "She doesn't know about the account in her son's names. Don't tell her yet. Let me handle the timing." She read it twice. Then she set the phone down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something that might break if it receives any impact, even though it was already broken. An account in her son's names. She looked at Lorenzo. His face, for the first time in 4 years, was entirely without strategy. "Tell me," she said. "There's a trust," he said, "established 18 months ago. Before you were pregnant. Matteo set it up through the Delaware entity. It's structured to receive transfers on behalf of Bellarosa bloodline heirs." He held her gaze. "When you got pregnant, the trust became active. Your sons are the named beneficiaries. The capital is significant. We're talking about a structure worth 9 figures. Valentina," he paused. "The federal investigation is going to find it. When they do, your sons' names are going to be attached to money from a criminal financial network before they are 20 days old." The restaurant went on around them, the low sound of other conversations, silverware, a server crossing the floor somewhere behind her. She sat very still. 9 figures. Her sons' names. 18 months ago, before she was pregnant, before any of this, Matteo had already built the structure that would make them heirs to the financial architecture of a criminal operation. The protection wasn't about her. It wasn't even about the bloodline as a concept. It was about the trust, about the named beneficiaries, about ensuring that the capital moved to the right place regardless of what happened to the adults in the room. She had been brought to the center of this not because she was Elisa's daughter, not because Matteo felt guilt about her mother, not because Lorenzo had calculated the Bellarosa connection, but because her sons, by existing, had triggered a financial mechanism that both men had built together and both men needed to control. The children were the point. They had always been the point. And she had spent 2 weeks thinking she was fighting to keep them safe, when what she was actually doing was fighting to keep them from being consumed by something that had been arranged around them before they were born. She stood up. "Where are you going?" Lorenzo said. "To my son," she said. She walked out of the restaurant. She was on the sidewalk, the October air hitting her face, when her phone rang. "Walsh, I need you to listen to me very carefully," he said, and his voice had the particular tone of someone who has received information that changes the shape of everything and is trying to convey it without collapsing the person on the other end. "The U.S. Attorney's Office made contact with me 20 minutes ago. They've been investigating the Bellarosa Trust for 6 months. They know about the account in your son's names, and they need to speak with you tonight." She stood on the sidewalk in the October dark. "Tonight," she said. "Right now." A pause. "Valentina, they're not coming after you. But your son's financial situation it's tangled in a way that requires your direct cooperation to untangle. If you cooperate, they can structure the legal separation of the trust from the criminal network in a way that protects your son's status." His voice tightened. "If you don't cooperate tonight, the trust gets frozen as a criminal asset, and your son's name stay attached to it indefinitely." She looked up at the Chicago sky orange-black, the particular color of a city at night, no stars visible through the light pollution, just that flat, luminous dark pressing down. Her sons were in incubators 11 days from coming home. Their names were on a trust worth 9 figures, connected to a criminal network built by 2 men who had treated them as instruments before they had names. She had burned Matteo's protection. She had given the documentation to the federal investigation. She had walked out of a meeting with Lorenzo without flinching. Now she was standing on a sidewalk in the Loop, and the federal government needed her cooperation to keep her son's names clean, and she had nothing left to trade except herself. And she was going to have to walk into a room with federal investigators and tell them everything she knew, including things that would damage people who had, in their complicated way, helped her, and she was going to have to do it tonight, in a coat that didn't quite fit, and an incision that hurt, and a body running on reserves it had already spent. She started walking. "Tell them I'm on my way," she said. "This is a work of complete fiction created for dramatic entertainment. All characters, organizations, and events are entirely imaginary." The U.S. Attorney's field office was on the 23rd floor of a federal building, 6 blocks from the restaurant. And Valentina walked there because it was 6 blocks, and she needed the cold air and the movement and the particular clarity that comes from putting one foot in front of the other when everything else is moving too fast to track. Walsh met her in the lobby. He looked at her face when she came through the security doors, and he didn't ask, how the meeting with Lorenzo had gone, which meant he could read the answer without asking. They rode the elevator in silence. The conference room was standard federal, a long table, chairs that were functional rather than comfortable, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look like they hadn't slept in a week, which, in this case, was accurate. 2 investigators, a woman named Castillo, lead agent on the financial crimes case, mid-40s, with a particular quality of someone who had been working this case long enough to find it personal, and a younger man named Park, who managed documents and said almost nothing, but watched everything. Castillo had a file in front of her. Valentina could see her own name on the tab. Mrs. Vescari Moretti, Valentina said. Valentina Moretti, she had decided this in the elevator. Done with the married name. Done with all of it. I know about the trust. The account in my son's names. Tell me exactly what you need from me. Castillo looked at her for a moment, the assessment of someone measuring how much to explain versus how much the person across the table already understands. You're ahead of where most people are when they sit in that chair, Castillo said. I've had a difficult few weeks. She folded her hands on the table. The trust. Castillo opened the file. The trust had been established 18 months earlier through the Delaware entity. Using a legal structure Mateo's financial people had built specifically to receive and hold capital on behalf of unnamed future beneficiaries, the designation to be completed upon the birth of qualifying heirs. The capital inside it was a combination of laundered proceeds from the shell company network and legitimate Bellarosa family assets, intermingled in a way that had been carefully designed to make separation difficult. When Valentina's pregnancy became known, the beneficiary designation had been completed. 3 names blank at the time of establishment, filled in 8 months ago by a Bellarosa family attorney using information from the NICU intake records. Her sons, named, enrolled as beneficiaries of a 9-figure trust before they were a week old. Without her knowledge, without her consent. The capital itself, Castillo said, is not entirely criminal in origin. Approximately 40% comes from legitimate Bellarosa family holdings, generational wealth, property, legal business income. The remaining 60% is laundered proceeds. She paused. If we freeze the trust as a criminal asset, all of it is held pending resolution of the criminal case. That process takes years. Your son's names remain attached to an active criminal investigation for the duration. And if I cooperate, we can work with your attorney to petition for a structured separation. The legitimate 40% can be ring-fenced in a clean trust for your sons, removed from the criminal proceeding entirely. The laundered 60% is forfeited. Castillo looked at her steadily. But the separation requires you to provide testimony about what you know, your direct knowledge of both Vescari's and Bellarosa's involvement, the conversations you've had, what you observed. It has to be firsthand, not Walsh's documents. Valentina looked at the table for a moment. She thought about Mateo's hands flat on the kitchen table, about his voice saying partly when she asked if Lorenzo's claim was true, about the photograph of her mother laughing, and the house prepared 3 weeks in advance, and the text message on Lorenzo's phone. She doesn't know about the account in her son's names. Don't tell her yet. Let me handle the timing. She thought about what testifying against Mateo meant. Not just legally, she understood the legal architecture clearly enough by now. She meant in the other sense, the human sense. He had helped her. The help was corrupted by self-interest, but the help had been real, the custody order that held, the time she'd been given to find Elena, the wall between her sons and Lorenzo during the most dangerous period. She was going to sit in a federal office and testify against a man who had, in his complicated way, kept her children safe enough to still be alive. She thought about her mother, who had walked away from all of this at 22 rather than negotiate with it. She was not 22. She had 3 sons with names on a criminal trust and 12 days until they came home, and walking away was not available to her. I'll testify, she said. She was there for 3 hours. She told them everything she knew, her direct observations, the conversations, the timeline. She was careful and specific, and she did not editorialize, and she did not try to manage Mateo's exposure, because managing it would have meant shading the truth, and the truth was the only thing she had left that was entirely her own. Walsh sat beside her the whole time. At one point, somewhere in the second hour, she had to stop. Not because she was overwhelmed, she was past overwhelmed, had moved through overwhelmed and out the other side into something that functioned like calm, but was actually the temporary stillness of complete depletion. She stopped because she had been speaking for a long time, and her throat was dry, and someone put a glass of water in front of her, and she drank half of it, and sat for a moment with her hands in her lap, and felt the incision, and felt the particular weight of the past 3 weeks sitting on her chest, and then she picked up where she had left off. Castillo thanked her at midnight. Park had a transcript printed and ready for signature within 20 minutes of the session ending, which told her they had been preparing for this conversation longer than tonight. She signed it. In the elevator going down, Walsh said, "The petition for trust separation will be filed tomorrow morning." Castillo said to expect a ruling within 10 days. He paused. "Valentina, you did the right thing, I know," she said. "How are you?" She thought about it honestly. "Empty," she said. "But it's a clean kind of empty." He nodded. He understood what she meant, or close enough. She went to Nina's. She slept for 9 hours straight, which she had not done since before the pregnancy. And when she woke up, the light coming through Nina's curtains was the thin gray light of a Chicago October morning, and she lay still for a few minutes listening to the building, the pipes, the distant street, Nina moving in the kitchen, and let herself exist without doing anything, which was its own kind of necessary. Over the next 3 weeks, things happened in the particular sequence of things that have been set in motion and cannot be recalled. The federal investigation, armed with Elena's documentation and Valentina's testimony, moved on Lorenzo's full operation within the first week. His shell company network was frozen. The Delaware entity was dissolved. Formal charges were filed against Lorenzo and 4 members of his financial team on money laundering, wire fraud, and conspiracy counts. Harlow withdrew from the case, citing conflict of interest, which was attorney language, for the situation has become too damaging to be associated with. Lorenzo's organization, the lieutenants, the infrastructure, the decade of carefully maintained relationships and influence did not survive the combination of the federal action and the internal fracturing that had been building since the first men flipped. Power structures that depend on the absolute confidence of the people beneath them are specifically vulnerable to the moment that confidence breaks, and Lorenzo's had broken. The men who had been receiving his calls did not receive his calls anymore. Mateo's exposure was significant but more legally complex. His attorneys were better, and his direct involvement in the criminal operations was more carefully insulated than Lorenzo's. He was not charged immediately. He was investigated formally, openly, with the particular attention of a federal office that now had documentation of his role and intended to follow it wherever it went. His financial assets in the United States were placed under review. He relocated, she would learn this later, from Walsh, who had heard it from Castillo, to somewhere in Europe, quietly, with the practical efficiency of a man who had always maintained the option of such a move and had now exercised it. Before he left, he sent her a letter, paper handwritten. Walsh brought it to her at Nina's apartment in an envelope with no return address. She read it once. He wrote that he understood what she had done and why. He wrote that her mother would have done the same, and that this was not a criticism. He wrote that the legitimate portion of the Bellarosa family holdings, the 40%, the generational wealth that was clean, he had directed his attorneys to release without contest to the petition for the trust separation, which was more than the federal process required him to do, and which would move the timeline for her sons in trust from 10 days to 4. He wrote, "At the end, I am sorry I wasn't what I presented myself to be. I was partly that. I was also partly something else. I hope the part that was true was worth something to you." She folded the letter and put it in the drawer of the nightstand in Nina's guest room. She didn't throw it away. On the 11th day after the restaurant meeting, her sons came home. The discharge took most of a morning paperwork, instructions, the careful loading of 3 infant car seats into a vehicle that was not a Bellarosa car and was not a car registered to Lorenzo Vescari, but was Nina's battered Subaru, which Nina had cleaned with an attention to detail she did not normally apply to her vehicle, and which Valentina noted without comment. The attending shook her hand at the NICU entrance. "They're strong," he said. He'd said variations of this for 3 weeks, but this time it had a different weight. It was a conclusion, rather than a hope. "All 3 of them, I know," she said. She carried Marco out. Nina carried the second one. She had started calling him Raphael in her head. Though she hadn't made any of the names official yet, had been waiting without quite knowing why. Carla, who had driven separately in her own car, carried the third. They put all 3 in the car. She sat in the back between 2 of the seats, which was not how the geometry was supposed to work, but which nobody argued with. They drove. She watched the city go past the windows, the lakefront, the neighborhoods, the particular Chicago light of a November morning, cold and clear and honest about what it was. She watched her sons breathe. The smallest one, Marco, had his hands fisted near his face the way he always did. Blind fists, all instinct. The one she was calling Raphael was asleep with a serenity that seemed improbable given the past 3 weeks. The third, who she was going to name Luca and had been calling Luca in her heart since the first time she'd seen his face, was awake and looking at the ceiling of the car with the focused incomprehension of a very new person and encountering a world that is much larger than expected. She put her finger against his palm. He gripped it. She exhaled. The apartment Walsh had helped her secure was on the north side, a 3-bedroom in a building with a doorman and a working elevator. Not large, not impressive. The exact right size for 4 people starting from close to nothing. It was hers alone, her name on the lease, her name on the utilities, money from a settlement advance against the Marshall estate that Walsh had negotiated with Lorenzo's remaining attorneys, who had been much more cooperative since the federal charges. Carla had been there the day before setting up the nursery. She had used the furniture from the old house, the cribs, the changing table, the dresser retrieved through a process that had involved Walsh and an inventory order and a moving company, and a day that Carla described in very few words because the few words were sufficient. The furniture was the same furniture. The room was different. That was, Valentina thought, exactly the right kind of continuity. She brought her sons inside. She laid them in the 3 cribs side by side and stood in the doorway of the nursery for a long time. Carla appeared at her shoulder. "Go sit down," Carla said. "I'm fine. You've been fine for 3 weeks. Go sit down." She sat down. She sat in the kitchen of her own apartment, in a chair she had chosen, at a table she had picked out from a second-hand shop 2 days ago with Nina, and she drank a cup of tea that Carla put in front of her, and she let the stillness of the place settle around her. This was hers. Everything in it, the slight unevenness of the floor, the window that let in the north light, the sound of the city coming up from the street, the 3 boys sleeping 12 feet away was hers, in the sense that mattered, which was not ownership but responsibility. She was responsible for all of it. There was no one else. That was the most terrifying thing she had ever felt. It was also, she was beginning to understand, the most solid. The custody hearing was 3 weeks later. By then, the landscape had changed enough that the hearing itself was almost anticlimactic, which was not the word she would have used from inside it, because nothing about sitting in a courtroom and having the details of the worst month of her life reviewed and adjudicated by a stranger ever feels anticlimactic. But from the outside, the outcome was not in serious doubt. The judge was not Calloway. The reassignment had stuck, and the new judge was a man named Okafor, appointed to the bench 2 years prior, with a reputation Walsh described as rigorous and fair, which in Walsh's vocabulary were the 2 highest compliments he paid to members of the judiciary. Harlow's replacement, Lorenzo, had retained new counsel, a firm from New York that specialized in high-exposure cases, made the arguments they were able to make, which were fewer than before and carried less weight than before. The organized crime environment argument had inverted. Both parties connected to Valentina had been exposed, which neutralized the argument that she specifically had placed herself in a compromised environment. The forensic documentation told the full story of both men's financial interests in the children, which reframed the custody contest from a dispute about parental fitness to a documented case of criminal financial motivation. Okafor granted Valentina sole physical and legal custody. Lorenzo was granted supervised visitation rights 2 hours per week at a facility, with a court-appointed monitor contingent on his ongoing compliance with the conditions of his federal pretrial release and subject to modification pending the outcome of his criminal trial. Walsh squeezed her arm when Okafor finished reading the ruling. She nodded. She did not cry in the courtroom. She had used her tears for other things, the private ones, the ones nobody had seen, the ones in Tina's guest room at 2 in the morning when the adrenaline finally ran out, and what was left was just the weight of everything she had carried. Those had been real tears. The courtroom felt like something else documentation, conclusion, the formal acknowledgement of something that had already been true for a while. She looked at Lorenzo across the courtroom. He was sitting very still. He had aged in the past month in the way that certain men age when the structure supporting them clamps in, not dramatically, but perceptibly. Something in the set of his jaw, in the quality of his attention, had changed. He was looking at Okafor, not at her. Then he looked at her. She held his gaze for a moment. She had thought about what she would feel in this moment. She had expected rage or satisfaction or something with an edge. What she actually felt was something quieter and more complicated, the particular exhaustion of having fought something to its conclusion, which is not the same as triumph, which does not feel the way you imagine it will when you are in the middle of the fighting. She looked at him and thought, "You made your choices." That was all. You made your choices, and the choices made a shape, and now the shape is finished, and we both have to live in the aftermath of it. She turned away. In the hallway after, one of Lorenzo's new attorneys approached Walsh with a document, a formal proposal for the visitation schedule, already prepared, which suggested that Lorenzo had accepted the ruling before it was read. Walsh reviewed it on the spot and said he'd respond by end of week. She stood nearby and looked at the courthouse hallway, the same marble floors, the same fluorescent lights, the same smell of paper and waiting, and she thought about the first time she'd been here with Lorenzo's financial documentation and Matteo's name on a page she hadn't read closely enough, and she thought about how differently she had understood everything then. Elena Voss appeared at her sentencing hearing 6 weeks later. Valentina was not present. She had her sons at home, and a day that did not allow for courthouse, but Walsh attended and reported back that evening. Elena received a reduced sentence, 3 years probation, no incarceration, contingent on her continued cooperation with the federal investigation. Her daughter Cora had been moved to a different school in a different suburb at the federal government's arrangement, and Elena was living in the same city as her daughter for the first time in 2 years. Walsh told Valentina this sitting at her kitchen table, with the same directness he'd used in the hospital 11 days postpartum when he'd told her about the custody filing. It was, she thought, his particular gift, the refusal to make information softer than it was, because soft information was less useful than true information. "Is she okay?" Valentina said. "She seemed okay," Walsh said. "She asked me to tell you something." She waited. She said, "Tell her the ledger was always going to end up somewhere. I just needed to find the right person to give it to." Valentina thought about that for a moment. "Tell her I understand," she said. Lorenzo's criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring. She did not expect to attend. Walsh would monitor it. Castillo's office would keep her informed as a witness and cooperating party. The outcome would affect the visitation arrangement and various financial settlements still working their way through the system, so she would need to know what happened, but knowing was different from watching. She had watched enough. The trust petition was resolved as Matteo had facilitated the 4-day timeline, the clean separation, the legitimate 40% ring-fenced in a new trust with Valentina named as sole trustee until her sons reached adulthood. She had retained a separate financial attorney, someone who had never been connected to either Matteo or Lorenzo to manage the trust going forward, and she had spent 2 afternoons with that attorney going through every document, every clause, every contingency, asking questions until she understood all of it herself. She was not going to have money she didn't understand again. She was not going to have anything she didn't understand again. One Tuesday in mid-November, she took her sons to the pediatrician for their first well-baby appointment outside the hospital context. A normal thing, a routine thing, the kind of thing that happens every day in every city to every family, unremarkable and essential. She put all 3 of them in the car herself. It took 45 minutes and required a system she had developed over the preceding 2 weeks, a specific sequence of steps for getting 3 infants into car seats without dropping anyone or losing her mind. It was unglamorous and exhausting, and occasionally she said words that were not appropriate for infant insingers, which the infants appeared to find soothing. She drove herself. She sat in the waiting room with 3 carriers arranged around her chair and a diaper bag that weighed approximately as much as a small dog, and she looked at the other parents in the room, a man with a toddler on his knee, a woman nursing a baby while scrolling her phone with the other hand, a grandmother holding a sleeping infant with the particular competence of someone who has held many infants and found them all to be essentially the same problems. And she felt, for the first time in a long time, something that was not vigilance. She felt ordinary, not in a bad way. In the way that ordinary is what you work toward when everything else is burning the ordinary of a Tuesday, A waiting room. 3 small people and 3 carriers who were breathing steadily and whose names were hers to give. She had named them the week before.